Welcome back to another story on N.O. Harry. This time, we're bringing you, What If Sherlock Exposed Dumbledore's Lies About Harry's Parents and Britain Demanded Answers. Your likes fuel our creativity. Subscribe and stay tuned. Here's the story. Chapter 1, The file on the floor. The package arrived on a Tuesday, which Sherlock Holmes considered the most dishonest day of the week. Mondays had the decency to announce themselves as terrible. Tuesdays pretended to be something better and never delivered. It came through the letterbox at 9:30 in the morning, landing flat on the floor of 221B, Baker Street with a sound that was somehow different from the sound of ordinary post. Sherlock noticed this from his position on the sofa, where he had been lying for the better part of 14 hours staring at a water stain on the ceiling that had begun to resemble the orbital path of a particularly erratic comet. He noticed the sound the way he noticed everything, involuntarily, completely, and with immediate annotation. Ordinary post landed with a soft friction slap, paper on wood. This had landed with a kind of weight that was disproportionate to its size. Like a stone dropped into still water. He didn't move for another 30 seconds, listening to Mrs. Hudson's footsteps in the kitchen below, the distant rhythm of John's shower running upstairs, the particular quality of silence that the flat had in the mornings before London fully woke up. Then he rolled off the sofa, picked up the package, and carried it to the kitchen table. It was a manila envelope, A4 size, sealed with ordinary brown tape. His address had been written in a hand he didn't recognize, neat, controlled letters that leaned very slightly to the right, suggesting a left-handed person who had been taught to write by a right-handed instructor and never quite reconciled the two influences. Educated. Precise. Old. The ink was standard black ballpoint, but the pressure was uneven in a way that spoke of slight tremor, possibly age-related, possibly not. No return address. The stamp was Royal Mail, but the postmark was smudged beyond legibility, which was either accident or intention, and Sherlock had long since stopped assuming accident. He slid it open. Inside was a single manila folder, perhaps 2 centimeters thick, filled with papers that were clearly photocopies of documents rather than originals. A handwritten note on plain white paper was clipped to the front. It read, "Mr. Holmes. You solve what the police cannot or will not. These are 2 deaths. 1 night. 30 years of no one asking why. Someone should ask why. The child deserved better than silence. No signature." Sherlock set the note aside and opened the folder. The first page was a death certificate. 2 of them, side by side on the same photocopy sheet. James Harold Potter, aged 21. Lily Jane Potter, née Evans, aged 21. Date of death, October 31, 1981. Cause of death, both certificates, homicide. Manner, unlawful killing by person or persons unknown. He read them twice, then moved to the next page. A police incident report, dated November 1, 1981, from the Somerset Constabulary. The language was standard procedural, but there were gaps in it that Sherlock identified immediately, not errors, not omissions born of laziness, but structured gaps. Deliberate absences. A house fire mentioned in the first paragraph that was not mentioned again. A notation that ministry officials were present at scene without any clarification of which ministry or what their authority was. A witness listed as a Dumbledore, address, Hogwarts, Scotland, and then no statement from that witness anywhere in the following pages. Just the name, like a placeholder that someone forgot to fill in. Or chose not to. Sherlock made coffee, which he drank standing at the kitchen counter, reading. The next section was newspaper clippings. Not from any paper he recognized, the Daily Prophet, which appeared to be some kind of specialist publication, its font and layout belonging to a different era of typography. The clippings were dated November 1981, and they discussed the Potters' deaths in a way that struck Sherlock as extraordinary. There was celebration in the language. Words like victory and the end of an era and he who must not be named defeated. References to something called you-know-who and the Dark Lord with a capital D and a capital L, as though this were a title rather than a descriptor. He turned this over in his mind, filing the strangeness temporarily and continuing. The medical examiner's report was the most interesting document in the folder, because it was the most obviously wrong. Both victims had died of what the report described as accelerated cardiac failure consistent with extreme neurological trauma, which was a phrasing Sherlock had never encountered in any medical literature. Accelerated cardiac failure was a real phenomenon. The cause cited, extreme neurological trauma, was technically possible but entirely unspecific, a catch-all that a competent ME would never accept without elaboration unless someone had told them not to elaborate. The report had been signed by a Dr. Penelope Crouch, Somerset, and bore a secondary authorization stamp from something called the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, which was not a department that existed within the NHS, the Home Office, or any government body Sherlock had ever encountered. He read the phrase again. Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. He set his coffee down. The final section of the folder was the most sparse and in some ways the most damning. It was a single-page child welfare record, dated November 2, 1981, one day after the deaths. It documented the placement of one Harry James Potter, age 15 months, with Vernon and Petunia Desley, 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. The placement had been authorized not by social services, not by any court, not by any family court judge, but by a single handwritten authorization note signed by Dumbledore, headmaster, Hogwarts School. 15 months old. Placed on a doorstep, and there was that word, in the incident notes, doorstep, someone had actually written the child was left on the doorstep, by a man who appeared to have no legal authority to place children anywhere, with a family the record described only as known relatives, suitable for care, with no supporting social services assessment, no home visit record, no welfare check documentation of any kind. Sherlock closed the folder, put both hands flat on the kitchen table, and stared at the wall for approximately 45 seconds. Then he opened his laptop. John Watson came downstairs at 10:15 in clean clothes with wet hair and the particular expression he wore when he'd slept well and was feeling optimistic about the day, which was the expression most likely to be dismantled by whatever Sherlock was doing. Sherlock was doing quite a lot. The kitchen table had disappeared under papers. The laptop was open with 6 browser tabs visible from the doorway, all of which appeared to be showing different things: census records, one screen, a map of Somerset on another, what looked like Company's House on a third. Sherlock himself was standing at the window with his phone in one hand and his violin bow in the other, which he was using as a pointer to direct his own thoughts at the middle distance. "You've had post," John said. "I've had a case." Sherlock turned. His eyes were the particular shade of focus that John had learned to recognize early in their friendship, the shade that meant Sherlock had found something that had its teeth in him and was not going to let go. 2 murders from 1981 dressed up as unsolved homicides. The official record is a masterpiece of deliberate incompetence. Someone spent a great deal of effort making sure the right questions would never be asked. John poured himself coffee and came to look at the table. 1981, that's 45 years ago. 44 years, 8 months, and 2 days, but yes. The Potters. James and Lily. Godric's Hollow, Somerset. Sherlock dropped the violin bow on the sofa and came to the table, pulling out the death certificates and laying them in front of John. 21 years old, both of them. One infant son, Harry James Potter. They were murdered on Halloween night. Their son survived. John read the certificates. He read them the way he read medical documents, quickly and thoroughly, with the trained eye of a man who had spent years in situations where documents could be the difference between a correct diagnosis and a fatal mistake. His expression shifted partway through from morning coffee neutrality to something more focused. "Homicide by person or persons unknown," he said. "But no arrest. No trial. No conviction. In a case where the killer was, according to every other document in this folder, apparently well known and publicly named. There are newspaper references to someone called Voldemort, also styled as He Who Must Not Be Named, which is a peculiar stylistic choice for a newspaper, being responsible for the deaths. But no prosecution. No body. No forensic record of any kind connecting this person to the scene. Sherlock pulled the me report across. And the cause of death is this. Read that phrase. John read it. Accelerated cardiac failure consistent with extreme neurological trauma. He looked up. That's not a real cause of death. That's someone describing a symptom and calling it a cause. What kind of neurological trauma? Blunt force? Chemical exposure? Electrical? This is a deliberately vague report. Written by a Dr. Penelope Crouch, who held a position with the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. Sherlock paused, watching John's face. Which is not an organization that appears in any government directory. Not the Home Office, not the NHS, not Cabinet Office. It does not exist. Then who authorized her to sign a death certificate? Excellent question. The answer appears to be the same man who, one day after these two people were murdered, placed their 15-month-old son on a doorstep in Surrey without any legal authority to do so. Sherlock pulled the child welfare record forward. Albus Dumbledore, headmaster of a school in Scotland called Hogwarts. John stared at the welfare record for a long moment. Something in his jaw tightened. John Watson had a particular response to evidence of harm done to children. It was one of the few things that bypassed his considerable self-control entirely and went straight to something harder and colder underneath. Sherlock had seen it before and always found it useful. Left on a doorstep, John said quietly. With no welfare assessment. No home visit. No record of any subsequent check-in. Sherlock sat down across from John. The Dursleys, Petunia Dursley is Lily Potter's sister, which makes her the child's aunt, are described only as suitable for care, a characterization that is unverified by any independent professional. He just left a baby on a doorstep in November. John set the document down. In 1981. On his own authority. On his own authority, yes. And the child, Harry Potter, appears to have remained with the Dursleys from November 1981 onwards, with no recorded contact from Dumbledore or any other party until presumably his enrollment in whatever school Hogwarts is. Sherlock picked up his phone and began typing. Which brings me to what I've been doing for the past 40 minutes. Which is finding out what Hogwarts is. He brought the phone to the table. It appears in no Department for Education registry. It has no Ofsted rating. It holds no standard educational accreditation. It does not exist on any official record that I can access through normal channels. And yet, he scrolled, there are census records from multiple decades containing children whose listed educational institution is Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, in Scotland. Hundreds of them. Going back centuries. John opened his mouth, closed it, then said, witchcraft. Wizardry, also. Yes. Sherlock. I know. That's not, I mean, schools don't just call themselves that. No. Which means either this is an extraordinarily long-running eccentricity, a religious institution of some kind, or, Sherlock set the phone down and looked at John with the expression he used when he was about to say something that he knew sounded outrageous but had already decided was true, or magic is real, it has been real for quite some time, and there is an entire parallel society built around it that operates within Britain with its own legal infrastructure, its own press, and its own method of signing death certificates for murder victims. The kitchen was quiet except for Mrs. Hudson's radio downstairs, playing something soft and morning appropriate that felt utterly incongruous. John picked up his coffee. He drank some of it. He set it back down. You're serious. I'm always serious. You believe, I believe the evidence. The evidence suggests an organized, functioning, hidden society with institutional structures including law enforcement. There are references in these clippings to something called the Ministry of Magic and an Aura Division, and a school that has operated for over 1,000 years. Sherlock folded his hands. Whether the mechanism by which this society operates is literally magic or is something else with a different label, I am not yet in a position to say. But the society exists. The institution exists. The child exists. And the murders were real. John was quiet for a moment, working through it the way he worked through everything, methodically, with a natural skepticism that Sherlock valued precisely because it was not infinite. John's skepticism had limits, and those limits were defined by evidence. Push enough evidence at John Watson and the skepticism didn't collapse, it adapted. That was what made him useful. Okay, John said finally. So someone who knew this hidden world sent you a cold case file about 2 people who were killed in it. And whose son was placed, by the man apparently responsible for that society's most prestigious school, into a non-magical family with no follow-up and no accountability. Why send it to you? Why not the police, or, because the police, as evidenced by the Somerset Constabulary report, were either cooperating with the cover-up or were actively excluded from any real investigation. And because, Sherlock picked up the handwritten note and read it again, someone should ask why. The child deserved better than silence. He put it down. Whoever sent this has tried the proper channels and found them closed. Or they're inside the hidden world and know that its own institutions will not help. John nodded slowly. Then he said, how old would Harry Potter be now? 35. Sherlock paused. But cross-referencing with the school enrollment record suggests he would currently be a student at Hogwarts, which means he was born in 1980, not 1981, making him 15, or 16, years old currently, depending on his birthday. He turned the laptop to face John. A census record was on the screen, Harry James Potter listed as a student in Scotland. He's there now. Has been since age 11. He's a kid, John said. He's the child they left on a doorstep. Sherlock stood, picking up his coat from the back of the chair. He's also the only surviving witness to whatever happened that night in Godric's Hollow, even if he was too young to remember it consciously. And he is currently under the care of the same man who placed him with an unvetted family, in a school that has no government oversight. He put the coat on. I think we should go to Scotland. Now. Do you have something more pressing? John looked at his coffee, then at the pile of documents, then at Sherlock, who was already checking his scarf. I'll get my jacket. Getting to Hogwarts turned out to be more complicated than getting anywhere had a right to be. Sherlock spent 3 hours on the train to Edinburgh running searches that came up empty in the specific way that told him the emptiness was constructed rather than natural. There were no satellite images of anything called Hogwarts in the Scottish Highlands. There was a stretch of land near Loch Ness where the satellite imagery had a curious, persistent cloud cover that appeared in photographs across different years, different weather conditions, and different seasons, the kind of obstruction that happened when an institution with significant resources wanted to avoid aerial photography. They're hiding a castle, John said, looking over his shoulder at the screen. A whole castle. At minimum. The legend of the school suggests it was built in the 9th century. If those records are accurate, then they've kept it hidden for over 1,000 years. Whatever method they're using is considerably more sophisticated than cloud seeding. Magic, John said. Possibly. You keep saying possibly. I keep waiting for a better explanation. Sherlock closed the laptop. There isn't one. They hired a car in Edinburgh and drove north, and somewhere in the stretch of motorway after Inverness, Sherlock's phone showed them something interesting, a small train station called Hogsmeade that appeared on older Ordnance Survey maps from the 19th century and had quietly vanished from modern ones. He found it anyway, because the road that led to it was still physically there even if the signs weren't, and because a local man at a petrol station outside Drumnadrahit gave them directions with the calm ease of someone for whom the place was simply part of the landscape, which meant that whatever concealment was in operation, it wasn't operating on everyone. Wizarding folk, are you? The man said, which was not what either of them had expected. Sherlock studied him. 60s, weathered hands, a watch that had stopped and hadn't been fixed. What makes you say that? The man shrugged. Nobody else asks for that road. Well, nobody who doesn't know it. You don't look like you know it, but you're asking direct, not confused, so I figured. He handed John the change from the fuel. Take the left after the old stone gate. There's a sign for a village. You can't see the school from the road, that's just how it is up there, but there's a boat at the lake. He said this the way a person might say there's a bus stop at the corner. Sherlock stored this information along with everything else it implied about the permeability of the boundary between the two worlds and drove on. The village of Hogsmeade existed in precisely the way that things exist when they're not trying very hard to hide but are relying on most people not looking directly at them. It was small, a high street of perhaps 15 or 20 shops, most of which were selling things that fell into the category of unusual without being immediately explicable. A sweet shop. A post office where the owls were not caged. A pub called the Three Broomsticks from which warm light was spilling in the late afternoon cold. People in the street wore robes in a variety of colors, some of them carrying long sticks that Sherlock filed under wands, presumably, moving with the comfortable normality of people who had never had to explain themselves to anyone who found them strange. John had stopped in the middle of the street and was just standing there, turning slowly. "Right," he said. "So magic is real." "Yes." Sherlock was already moving toward the lake. "Just, you know." "Right." John jogged to catch up. "Magic is real and we drove here in a hire car. We could have taken the train. I assume there is one." That's not the point I was making." The lake was enormous, dark, and absolutely calm in a way that felt like stillness that had been deliberate rather than natural. On the far side of it, barely visible in the evening light but impossible to miss once seen, was the castle. Towers and turrets, lit windows scattered like fallen stars across the stone face of it, perched on a cliff above the water with the settled confidence of something that had been exactly where it was for a very long time and intended to stay. John stared at it. "Right," he said again. There was a boat at the shore, wooden and unattended, with oars that appeared to have been recently used. Sherlock stepped in without hesitation. John, after a moment that was long enough to acknowledge the absurdity and short enough to indicate he'd made his decision, stepped in after him. The oars moved on their own, which John watched with the expression of a man who was revising several foundational assumptions in real time. Sherlock watched the castle get closer. The woman who met them at the main doors was not what Sherlock had expected from a school, though he acknowledged he didn't know what he had expected. She was tall and angular, in dark green robes, with square spectacles and the bearing of someone who had been telling people what to do for decades and had never once doubted whether she was right to do it. She looked at the two men standing on her doorstep with the calm, measuring assessment of someone who had seen far stranger things and survived them. "This is a school," she said. "Not a tourist destination." "Professor McGonagall, I presume," Sherlock said. He had found her name in the sparse records he'd been able to pull, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. John Watson. We're not tourists. We're here about James and Lily Potter." The effect of those names on Minerva McGonagall was subtle and total. It moved across her face like a cold front, something shutting down, something else opening up, something that might have been grief underneath everything if you were watching closely enough. Sherlock was always watching closely enough. "How do you know that name?" she said, and her voice was very controlled. "I know a great many names. I also know the manner of their deaths, the identity of the person who placed their son in an unsupervised placement without legal authority, and the fact that the child welfare record for Harry Potter contains not a single follow-up assessment in 14 years. He held her gaze. "I'm not here to cause trouble for your school, Professor. I'm here because 2 people were murdered and the file on their deaths is full of deliberate holes. I'd like to fill them." McGonagall looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at John, who met her look steadily, with the quiet gravity of a man who had seen enough of the world to know when something mattered. "You'd better come in," she said. She put them in a small sitting room off the entrance hall, stone walls, a fire already burning, portraits on the walls that moved and murmured to each other in low voices that Sherlock noted and catalogued without comment. A portrait of a silver-haired man in half-moon spectacles glanced at him with an expression of faint alarm before looking away, which Sherlock noted as well. McGonagall sat across from them and folded her hands. "Who sent you the file?" she asked. "I don't know. Unsigned note, untraceable postmark." Sherlock opened his bag and laid the folder on the low table between them. But whoever it was, they had access to police records, the Me report, the Daily Prophet from November 1981, and the child welfare documentation. They knew what to pull. McGonagall looked at the folder but didn't open it. "James and Lily Potter were killed by Lord Voldemort," she said, in the careful tone of someone reciting a fact that they have recited many times. "He went to their home in Godric's Hollow. He killed them. Their son Harry survived, for reasons that no one fully understands." "That's the official version," Sherlock said. "I'm interested in the other version." "There isn't another version. There are always other versions. Especially when the official version has been written to prevent anyone asking for them." He pulled the Me report from the folder and pushed it across. "The cause of death on these certificates is medically incoherent. The authorizing signature is from an organization that doesn't appear in any government registry. The police report references ministry officials at the scene who were never named, never interviewed, and whose presence at an active murder scene was simply recorded and then ignored." He leaned forward slightly. "And the child, Professor McGonagall. Harry Potter was placed with an unvetted family by a man with no legal child welfare authority. Without any assessment. Without any follow-up." He watched her face. "You knew these people?" Her jaw tightened. "Yes." "You knew the child?" "Yes." "Did you raise a concern?" "About the placement?" The pause was short but it was there. "I expressed reservations." "To whom?" Another pause. "To Albus Dumbledore." Sherlock let the silence sit for a moment, and in the silence the fire crackled and a portrait in the corner whispered something urgent and was immediately shushed by the portrait next to it. "I'd like to speak with Harry," Sherlock said. "He's a student. He's 15 years old, his parents were murdered, and no one has ever told him the full truth of it." Sherlock's voice was even, unhurried, absolutely certain. "He deserves to know. Whatever the complications, whatever the sensitivities, he deserves to know." McGonagall looked at him for a long time. The fire popped. A portrait cleared its throat. "He's in the library," she said finally, and stood. "I'll bring him." She left, and John leaned toward Sherlock in the quiet that followed. "You saw something in her expression." "She wanted to tell someone," Sherlock said simply. "For a very long time. She just needed permission." John looked at the moving portraits, at the fire, at the stone walls of a castle that shouldn't exist. "Sherlock," he said, "I need you to know that I am being remarkably composed right now." "You are, yes. I've been meaning to mention it. The portraits are watching us. They have been since we sat down." Sherlock glanced at the silver-haired portrait, which immediately looked at the ceiling. "I think that one knows more than he's showing. It's a portrait. Everything presents information. The question is always whether you're reading it." He picked up the folder and held it in both hands. "Harry Potter is about to walk through that door, and his world is about to become considerably more complicated. I want to make sure we do this correctly." "Meaning what?" Sherlock thought about the handwritten note. The child deserved better than silence. He thought about a 15-month-old on a doorstep in November. He thought about 44 years of carefully constructed emptiness in a file that should have been full. "Meaning we tell him the truth," he said. "All of it. And we don't apologize for doing so." John nodded. Outside the door, footsteps were coming down a stone corridor, two sets, one measured and precise, one younger, slightly quicker, with the particular rhythm of someone who walked fast because they were always going somewhere important or wondering if they should be. The door opened. Harry Potter walked in, and he was already looking at Sherlock with eyes that were green and alert and asking a question he hadn't spoken yet, and Sherlock looked back at him and felt the thing he sometimes felt at the beginning of a case that was going to be the kind that mattered. Not excitement. Certainty. The certainty that this was not over. That it was, in fact, just beginning. "Harry," Professor McGonagall said, "this is Sherlock Holmes. He's come from London." She paused, and in the pause she seemed to make a decision of her own, something private and long deferred. "He's come about your parents." Harry stood very still. The alertness in his expression didn't change, but something underneath it did, a shift in the quality of his attention, like a room in which someone had quietly turned the lights up. "My parents," he said. Not a question. Something else. Something already leaning forward. "Yes," Sherlock said. "Sit down, Harry. There's quite a lot to discuss." Chapter 2, The Boy Who Lived in a Lie. Harry sat. He sat the way people sit when they're trying not to look like they need to, with his back straight and his hands on his knees and his whole body arranged into a posture of controlled patience that he'd probably learned from years of being told to wait, to trust, to not ask questions that hadn't been invited. Sherlock recognized the posture because he'd seen it on people in interview rooms, not suspects, but people who had spent their lives being managed by other people and had built a kind of armor out of appearing cooperative. McGonagall had brought tea, which nobody touched, and then positioned herself near the door in a way that was either protective or conflicted or both. "Professor McGonagall said you're from London," Harry said. His voice was steady. 15 and already good at keeping himself measured. "You're a detective." "Consulting detective," Sherlock said. "The only one." "There's a distinction." Something flickered in Harry's expression. "What does that mean?" "It means the police come to me when they've run out of ideas." "Which they do, regularly." Sherlock opened the folder on the table but didn't push it toward Harry yet. "I was sent a case file. 2 deaths, 1981. Your parents." Harry's hands tightened on his knees, slightly. "I know how my parents died." "Tell me what you know." The question seemed to surprise him. He glanced at McGonagall, who said nothing, and then looked back at Sherlock with the reassessing expression of someone who'd been expecting to be told things and found themselves being asked instead. "Voldemort killed them," he said. "He came to our house in Godric's Hollow. He killed my dad first, then my mum. She died protecting me. And whatever he tried to do to me reflected back on him because of her sacrifice, and he lost his body. He disappeared. For years." "And where did you learn this?" "Dumbledore, mostly. Professor Dumbledore." Harry paused. "And Hagrid." "And, it's what everyone knows." "What everyone knows," Sherlock repeated. He looked at Harry directly. "How old are you?" 15. "You were 15 months old when your parents died. You have no personal memory of the event." "No. So what you know is what you've been told." Harry's jaw shifted. Not defensively, it was actually the opposite of defensive, it was the expression of someone who had just felt the floor develop a slight but significant tilt. "Yes." "Good." Sherlock opened the folder fully. "Then let's talk about what the record actually shows." He walked Harry through it methodically but not slowly. Harry was not a person who needed to be led through things step by step, that was clear within the first 2 minutes of talking to him. He made connections quickly, filed information without prompting, and when something didn't add up he said so immediately rather than waiting for permission to notice. "The cause of death is wrong," Harry said, leaning over the me report. He said it plainly, not dramatically. "That's not a real cause of death." "Correct." "Who signed it?" "A Dr. Penelope Crouch, authorized by the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes." Sherlock watched his face. "You recognize the department name?" It's part of the Ministry of Magic. They're supposed to cover up, they deal with magical incidents that affect muggles. Non-magical people. Harry's frown deepened. But they don't do death certificates. That's not what they do. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement handles anything criminal. The MLE, Aurors, they'd have been the ones investigating. He looked up. Why is the MLE not in any of these documents? It was a good question. It was, in fact, the question Sherlock had been waiting for someone to ask, the question that exposed the shape of the manipulation most cleanly. They're not in any of these documents because someone ensured they wouldn't be, he said. Think about that. Your parents are murdered. The law enforcement division responsible for investigating magical crime is not in any of the paperwork. The investigation was effectively handled by a department whose job is to manage cover-ups. Harry stared at the documents. He was very still. And the Somerset police, Sherlock continued, were clearly given a sanitized version of events and then quietly sidelined. Which requires cooperation from someone with authority in both worlds. He let that sit for a moment. This is not a case of bureaucratic failure, Harry. Someone with significant power in the wizarding world made very deliberate decisions about what would and would not be investigated. Dumbledore, Harry said quietly. It wasn't an accusation yet. It was the sound of a word being picked up and examined for weight. His name appears on every significant document in that folder, Sherlock said. The witness record he never gave a statement for. The child welfare authorization. He pulled the welfare record across. This one. Harry read it. He read it slowly, which was the first time he'd slowed down for anything, and Sherlock understood why. It was one thing to read about your parents' death certificates, which are about something that already happened, and another to read a document that described what happened to you, something done to you by a named person, a person you knew, a person who had told you his choices were made in your best interest. He left me on a doorstep, Harry said. In November. Without any welfare assessment. I knew that. Harry's voice had changed slightly. Still controlled, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there before, not anger yet, something that comes before anger, which is understanding arriving somewhere it hasn't been invited. Hagrid always told the story like it was fine. Like it was the right call. He carried me there himself on Dumbledore's orders. Put me on the doorstep with a letter. He set the document down. I never thought about it as a legal thing before. It was just, the story of how I ended up at the Dursleys. What were the Dursleys like? John asked. It was the first thing John had said, and he said it in the tone he used when the answer mattered to him personally. Harry looked at him. Not great, he said, which was the careful understatement of someone who had learned to describe their own experiences in ways that didn't invite too much sympathy. They didn't want me there. I knew that from pretty much as early as I can remember. I slept in the cupboard under the stairs until I got my Hogwarts letter. John's expression didn't change much. The jaw moved. The eyes went a specific kind of flat that Sherlock knew meant he was putting something away to deal with later because dealing with it now would get in the way. The cupboard under the stairs, John said. Until I was 11, yeah. And no one, from this school, from anyone, checked on you in those 10 years. Harry seemed to actually think about this, as though it hadn't occurred to him to think about it in precisely those terms. No, he said. No, Dumbledore knew I was there, obviously. He sent my letter there. But nobody came. Not until Hagrid came to tell me I was a wizard. At which point you were 11 years old, Sherlock said. And had been living in a cupboard. And wearing my cousin's old clothes and not being told what I was. Harry said it plainly. The flatness in his voice wasn't bitterness, it was the particular evenness of someone who has processed something so thoroughly that it has become simply fact. Every year before Hogwarts was, yeah. It was what it was. It was neglect, John said. What you've described is neglect. It has a name. Harry looked at John for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not with tears or visible emotion, just a quiet readjustment, the way a person's face changes when they hear a word they've always known the meaning of but never heard applied to their own experience. "I know," he said finally. "I've known for a while. Dumbledore always," he stopped. "Always what?" Sherlock asked. "Always had a reason." Harry's voice was careful now, precise, like he was taking something apart as he spoke. "For everything. The Dursleys, he always said there was a protection there, blood magic, my aunt being my mum's sister. He said it kept me safe. He said it was necessary." He looked at the folder. "He's always got a reason." "The blood protection is real," McGonagall said from near the door. They'd half forgotten she was there. She came forward now and sat in the chair beside Harry, and the way she sat, closer than strictly necessary, the chair turned slightly toward him, said something about what she'd decided when she'd gone to find him. Lily's sacrifice created a genuine protective charm. While you were in your aunt's house and called it home, the protection was active. She paused. "But that was not the reason Albus left you there with no supervision for 10 years. The protection required only that you be there. It did not require that you be unhappy. The room was very quiet. He knew they weren't kind to you." Harry asked her. McGonagall looked at him steadily. "I told him," she said, and the words had the quality of something that had been sitting in a locked room for years. "I told him on the night he placed you there. I had spent the whole day in the street, watching them. I told him they were the worst sort of muggles. I told him you might be better placed elsewhere." She held his gaze. "He told me it was necessary. That you needed to be with your mother's blood. That growing up knowing you were famous would ruin you." She said the last sentence without editorializing, which somehow made it worse. He was not entirely wrong about the protection. But he used a real consideration to justify a choice that had consequences he could have prevented. Harry absorbed this. You could almost see it happening, the information being set against a 14-year mental model of Albus Dumbledore, like placing a transparency over a map and seeing where the lines don't quite match. "He wanted me not to know how famous I was," Harry said slowly. "He wanted me to come to Hogwarts without having grown up knowing I was the boy who lived." "Without, what?" "Without ego. Without expectations." His voice hadn't risen. If anything it had gotten quieter, which Sherlock found considerably more interesting than shouting would have been. "He engineered my childhood. He took away he decided what I should and shouldn't know and didn't ask me." "No," Sherlock said. "He didn't. And my parents?" "Yes." Harry looked at the death certificates. He'd been looking at them in short intervals the whole time, the way people look at something they know they'll need to absorb in pieces. "You said the official account has holes. What's actually in the holes?" Sherlock leaned forward. "The holes tell us several things. First, that the MLE's absence is deliberate. If Voldemort was known to be responsible, and he clearly was, it's in the press, it's public knowledge in your world, then why was there no formal magical prosecution? He had followers. They were arrested and tried. But the murders of your parents were not the subject of any formal Wisengamot proceeding." "Why?" Harry frowned. "Because he disappeared. He lost his body that night." "He lost his body, yes. But the deaths of two people don't require the perpetrator to be alive or present to be formally investigated. The evidence is investigated. The circumstances are examined. The question of how he found them is asked." Sherlock paused. "Your parents were in hiding, Harry. Did you know that?" "Yes. The Fidelius charm. They were hidden. I knew that. The Fidelius charm conceals a location from anyone who is not told it by the secret keeper. Which means that for Voldemort to find them, someone who knew the location told him." Sherlock let that sit. Do you know who their secret keeper was? And here was where it happened. Here was where the thing Sherlock had been watching for finally arrived, not a collapse, not a dramatic moment, but a kind of stillness that moved across Harry's face as a piece of information connected to another piece of information in a way that hadn't happened before. I thought it was Sirius, Harry said. Very quietly. Yes. That's what you were told. Sirius Black, your godfather, who was imprisoned in Azkaban one day after your parents' deaths, convicted of their betrayal and the murder of 12 Muggles. I know the story. He escaped in my 3rd year. He was a murderer, everyone thought, I thought. Harry stopped himself. But then I met him. I was with him in the Shrieking Shack that year. He said he wasn't the secret keeper. He said they'd switched, that it was Peter Pettigrew. Peter Pettigrew, who was killed by Sirius Black in the street, according to the prosecution, Sherlock said. Except that Pettigrew's death was never forensically confirmed. There was no body. Harry was looking at him with the fixed, total attention of someone who has just seen the edge of something very large. Peter Pettigrew is alive, he said. He was hiding as Ron's pet rat for 12 years. I saw him. We had him. And then he escaped. His voice changed, a jagged edge suddenly in it. He escaped and went back to Voldemort. He helped bring him back. So the man convicted of betraying your parents, your godfather, never received a trial, Sherlock said. The silence after this was different from the ones before. What? Harry said. Sirius Black was placed in Azkaban in November 1981 without a trial. Without appearing before the Wisengamot. Without presenting evidence. He was simply, Sherlock pulled a clipping from the folder, a brief one, a bare 6 lines in the Daily Prophet from December 1981, noted as imprisoned, and then forgotten. He said it in front of Harry. There is no record of a trial, Harry. Because there was never one. Harry read the clipping twice. His hands were flat on the table now, both of them, pressed down as though he needed to feel something solid. He's been in Azkaban he's been there since before I can remember, Harry said. 13 years. 13 years in Azkaban and there was never a trial. No. And Dumbledore knew this. Dumbledore knew who Sirius was. He knew the Potters, he was there. Harry stopped. He ran a hand through his hair, which was already spectacularly untidy and became more so. He would have known. He was connected to all of it. He was there. He placed me with the Dursleys when Sirius was my legal godfather. The observation landed in the room with the weight of a stone. Yes, Sherlock said. Your parents had made Sirius Black your godfather. Under normal circumstances, with your parents dead and your godfather innocent, which we now have strong reason to believe he was, the legal and moral placement would have been with him. But Dumbledore put me with the Dursleys. Without a trial being held to establish Sirius's guilt. Without any investigation into whether Sirius was actually the secret keeper. Without, seemingly, any meaningful inquiry into the events of that night at all. Sherlock folded his hands. Someone who was present at the scene, who had authority in both the magical and non-magical world, who influenced the response of both the Ministry and the Muggle police, ensured that the investigation moved quickly in the direction of a predetermined conclusion and then stopped entirely. Dumbledore, Harry said again. But it was different this time. Before it had been a question trying to become an answer. Now it sounded like an answer that was just becoming real. John, who had been watching Harry throughout all of this, said quietly, Harry. Are you all right? Harry looked at him. For a moment the controlled, measured quality dropped away and he just looked young, not fragile, not devastated, but young in the way people look when the ground shifts under them and they're still working out whether it shifted a little or a lot. I don't know yet, he said honestly. It's a lot too. He stopped. Shook his head. No. I'm fine. I want to keep going. John nodded. The report from the night they died, Harry said, pulling the police document toward him. It says ministry officials were present. Which ministry officials? Unnamed, Sherlock said. Dumbledore would know. He was there. He was listed as a witness. Harry scanned the document. He was there and he gave no statement and no one asked him to. He set it down. He's in every document and nowhere in any document at the same time. He's the whole. Sherlock said nothing, because Harry had arrived at the conclusion himself and there was no reason to interrupt that. McGonagall was very still. Something was happening behind her expression, something that looked like relief alongside grief, which was not a comfortable combination, but it was an honest one. Professor, Harry said, turning to her. You were there that night, weren't you? You were watching our street. I watched Privet Drive, not Godric's Hollow. I was there the day after. But you knew. You knew from the beginning that something wasn't. He stopped. Did you know about Sirius? About there being no trial? McGonagall's expression tightened. I knew there was no trial. I did not. I did not pursue it as I should have. In the aftermath of everything, with Voldemort gone and the celebrations and the grief, I told myself Albus knew best. That he had reasons. She paused, and the pause was made of the specific weight of a compromise made long ago that had never stopped being heavy. I told myself that for a very long time. Harry looked at her for a moment, then back at the table. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. What do we do? He asked Sherlock. Not plaintive, direct. What's the next move, essentially? We establish a clear, documented picture of the deception before we do anything public, Sherlock said. I need access to Sirius Black. He's in hiding. He was never cleared. After third year when Pettigrew escaped, the Ministry doubled down on the warrant for him. He's wanted. Dumbledore knows where he is but, Harry paused. Actually I know where he is. I write to him. Of course he did. Sherlock almost smiled. Can you reach him quickly? I can send an owl tonight. He might be able to come, he has ways of moving without being caught. Harry looked at the folder again, at the thin sheaf of documents that represented the official record of his parents' lives and deaths. You said someone sent you this anonymously. Yes. Do you have any sense of who? Sherlock had been thinking about this since Edinburgh. The specific combination of documents in the folder, some of them were wizarding documents, things that would require access to ministry records or personal archives. The child welfare record in particular was not the kind of thing that circulated widely. Someone who had access to ministry records and the personal knowledge to know which ones mattered, he said. Someone who has been sitting on this information and recently decided it was time for it to come out. He glanced at McGonagall. Someone who couldn't act through official channels because the official channels are the problem. McGonagall met his gaze with an absolutely neutral expression that told Sherlock everything. He let it go. For now. There's someone else we need to talk about, Harry said. His tone had shifted slightly, less analytical, more careful. Dumbledore. Yes. He's going to know something is happening. This school, information moves differently here. He probably already knows you're here. Harry looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone who had been observed their entire Hogwarts career by the same person and understood how that observation worked. He'll want to know what you found and he'll want to manage it. I'm aware. He's very good at that. Managing things. Managing people. Harry's voice was flat, not contemptuous, just accurate. He does it kindly, mostly. That's what makes it work. He asks you to trust him and he says it in a way that makes you feel small for not trusting him. Sherlock looked at him for a moment. You've thought about this before. Harry met his look. I've had a difficult year. I've been thinking about a lot of things. Something had happened to Harry recently that he wasn't discussing, that was clear. The careful maturity, the way he'd navigated everything Sherlock had just told him without fragmenting, that didn't come from an easy year. But it wasn't the moment to ask, so Sherlock filed it. "When Dumbledore comes," Sherlock said, "and he will come this evening, I imagine, almost certainly," Harry said. "Let me speak first. Don't manage what you say to protect his feelings or to avoid a scene. Your instinct may be to defer to him, he's been a significant authority figure in your life since you were 11. Don't." Harry looked at him with the faintest trace of something that might, in better circumstances, have been a wry expression. "I'm actually pretty good at not deferring to people." John made a small sound that was probably a laugh suppressed into a cough. "Good," Sherlock said. "He'll be calm," Harry continued. "He's always calm. He'll have a reason. He'll have several reasons, stacked. And they'll be good reasons, some of them, that's the thing. He'll be right about parts of it, which makes the parts he's wrong about harder to." He was interrupted by the door to the sitting room opening without a knock. The man who walked in was exactly what the portrait in the corner had suggested, silver-haired, half-moon spectacles, robes of deep midnight blue, bearing the quiet authority of someone who had been the most important person in every room he'd entered for the better part of a century. He looked at Sherlock first, then at John, then at the open folder on the table with its scattered documents, and then at Harry. His expression was warm. Concerned. Precisely calibrated to the temperature of the room. "Harry," Albus Dumbledore said. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are, actually," Sherlock said pleasantly. "Do sit down." Dumbledore looked at Sherlock with mild, good-humored interest, the way a chess player might look at an opponent who'd made an unexpected opening move. "You must be Mr. Holmes. Your reputation precedes you." "Most things about me do," Sherlock said. "Sit down, Professor." There was a beat, very brief, barely there at all, in which Dumbledore and Sherlock simply looked at each other, and in that beat a great deal was communicated without a word of it being spoken. Sherlock read it the way he read everything. The slight elevation of Dumbledore's chin, defensive and controlled. The precise positioning of his hands, relaxed, deliberate. The choice to stand just slightly off-center in the room, close enough to the door to control access to it without looking like he was doing so. Dumbledore sat. "I understand you've been looking into some very old business," he said. "2 murders," Sherlock said. "I don't think of them as old. The people who committed them or allowed them to go unanswered are still alive. That makes them current. The murders were committed by Voldemort," Dumbledore said, with the careful gentleness of a man correcting a minor error. "That is not in dispute. The murders, no. What's in dispute is everything that happened after the murders." Sherlock picked up the child welfare record and held it so Dumbledore could see it. "Including this." Dumbledore looked at it. His expression didn't change in any way that was obvious. But Sherlock watched the specific movement of his eyes, the brief flicker of something that was not guilt, exactly, more like recognition, like a man looking at an old decision and still believing in it. "Harry needed to be protected," Dumbledore said. "He needed to be safe," Harry said. His voice was very quiet. "There's a difference." Dumbledore looked at Harry with something that appeared to be genuine pain, which Sherlock believed was real. The man was not purely a liar, he was something more complicated. He was someone who had hurt people in the direction of what he believed was right. "Harry," Dumbledore began. "There was no trial for Sirius," Harry said. The name landed differently from the welfare record. Something moved through Dumbledore's expression that was harder to categorize, not surprise, which was telling. Not protest. Just a brief, visible passage of complexity, quickly composed. "The circumstances at the time, there was no trial," Harry said again, same tone, same volume. He was not performing anger. He was simply not moving off the fact. "My parents' secret keeper was supposed to be Sirius. Sirius says it was Pettigrew. Pettigrew is alive, I've seen him. And Sirius spent 13 years in Azkaban without standing in front of a single court. He looked at Dumbledore with those green eyes that were, Sherlock suddenly understood, his mother's eyes in his father's face. You were there. You had more authority than anyone in the ministry. You could have demanded a trial. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I could have. The honesty of it, the simple, undefended yes, was somehow more disturbing than a denial would have been. It said that the man across the table knew exactly what he had done and had filed it under necessary. Why didn't you? Harry asked. And Dumbledore looked at him, not around him, not above him, directly at him, and said, because I needed you where you were. The fire was the only sound. Harry looked at Dumbledore for a long time. Something settled in his expression, not hardened, not collapsed, but settled, like a question that had been vibrating for years finally finding a still point. The blood protection, Harry said. Yes. And if I'd been with Sirius? If I'd grown up with my godfather, knowing what I was, knowing the world, you might have been entirely different, Dumbledore said. You might have grown up with expectations that would have, you wanted me to be a certain kind of person, Harry said. Still quiet. Still perfectly clear. You wanted me humble and unaware and ready. You engineered me. Dumbledore's expression was complicated enough to be honest. I did what I believed was necessary to give you the best possible chance at surviving what was coming. You decided that. For me. Without asking me. Without asking Sirius. Harry's voice went very briefly to something rawer underneath, not breaking, just opening a window for a second onto what was underneath all the composure. They were my parents. The room held that for a moment. Then Harry looked at Sherlock. What do we do next? It was, Sherlock thought, one of the most precise demonstrations of character he had witnessed in a long time. No tears. No explosion. No performance. Just the decision, made quietly in real time, to ask the right question and move forward. We contact Sirius, Sherlock said. We document everything formally. And then we make it impossible for any of this to be buried again. He looked at Dumbledore pleasantly. I hope you don't mind, Professor, but I've already arranged for copies of everything in that folder to be held by 3 separate parties in London. In the event that the originals go missing. Dumbledore looked at him. For the first time something that might have been irritation or concern passed through his expression before the warmth recomposed itself over the top. You are very thorough, Mr. Holmes. I am, yes. Sherlock picked up the folder and stood. One more question, Professor. The person who sent me this file. They had access to ministry records and to personal documents. They knew what was relevant. He watched Dumbledore's face with the care of a surgeon. Who do you think sent it? Dumbledore was quiet for a moment, and in that moment Sherlock catalogued 17 small things simultaneously, the tightening around his eyes, the way his right hand moved almost imperceptibly on the arm of his chair, the direction in which he briefly looked before looking back. I genuinely don't know, Dumbledore said. Which was, Sherlock noted, not the same as saying no one he knew was responsible. Interesting, Sherlock said simply, and the word hung in the room like smoke. John stood as well, collecting his jacket. He looked at Harry, who was still sitting at the table with the documents in front of him, and said, We'll sort out a place to stay tonight, if the village has, you can stay here, McGonagall said from the door. I'll arrange rooms. She said it in a tone that dared anyone to argue, including the headmaster, and nobody did. Harry looked at the documents on the table for another moment, then began carefully stacking them back into the folder. His hands were steady. His expression was thoughtful rather than devastated. He was processing the way a person processes when they're genuinely trying to understand rather than simply react. He stood, and as he stood he glanced at the portrait in the corner, the silver-haired one who had been watching since they arrived. The portrait met his eyes, and for just a moment something passed between them that Sherlock couldn't quite read but which suggested a familiarity, a long shared history of looking and being looked at. Harry looked away first. My parents were real people, Harry said quietly, to no one in particular. Not symbols. Not sacrifices in someone's plan. They were 21 years old. He looked at the death certificates one last time before closing the folder. I'd like to know who they actually were. He said it simply, without sentiment, which was what made it the most sentimental thing Sherlock had heard all evening. That, Sherlock said, is also something we can find out. Harry nodded. Then he picked up the folder and tucked it under his arm, and Sherlock noted that he didn't ask permission to take it, didn't look at Dumbledore, didn't look at McGonagall for reassurance. He just took it, because it was his, because the story of his parents belonged to him and he was done with the version where someone else held it. Dumbledore watched him leave the room, and on the old man's face, finally, past all the warmth and all the careful composure, was something that looked like the realization that the particular chess game he had been playing for 15 years had just changed its rules entirely. Outside the door, Harry's footsteps went down the stone corridor, quick and purposeful and not looking back. Chapter 3, The Architecture of Deception. The owl Harry sent reached Sirius Black somewhere in the Scottish wilderness at 3 in the morning, and the reply arrived back before breakfast, which told Sherlock something about the state of Sirius's sleep and the readiness with which he'd been waiting for something like this. The note was short. Tell me when and where. I'll be there before you finish the sentence. Harry read it twice, then handed it to Sherlock without comment. Sherlock handed it to John. John read it and set it down on the breakfast table with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing not to say anything about what it meant that a wrongfully imprisoned person had been sitting in a cold Scottish wilderness waiting for someone to come. Breakfast in the Great Hall was an experience that Sherlock processed efficiently and then largely ignored. For long tables, several hundred students, enchanted ceiling that reflected the grey November morning outside with more meteorological accuracy than seemed necessary. He noted the owl post arriving, the food appearing from nowhere, the candles burning despite daylight, all of it catalogued and filed as background. What he was actually watching was the table where Harry sat between a girl with exceptional hair and an expression of fierce analytical attention, and a boy with red hair who was eating with the focused dedication of someone who had decided the world's problems could wait until after toast. The girl, Hermione Granger, Harry had introduced them briefly in the corridor, had already asked for her own look at the folder. She'd read for 20 minutes over Harry's shoulder the previous night, and the expression that had occupied her face throughout was the specific expression of a person encountering documentary evidence for something they'd suspected but couldn't prove, and finding the sensation simultaneously vindicating and horrible. She's going to be useful, John said quietly, beside Sherlock. She already is, Sherlock said. She's been mentally cross-referencing every document against her knowledge of wizarding law since she opened the folder. Watch her left hand. John watched. Hermione's left hand was tapping a very slight, very rapid pattern against the table, not nervousness, rhythm. The rhythm of structured thought. She's found something, John said. She found several somethings. She'll tell us when she's certain. Sherlock drank his coffee. That's the sign of a good mind, she won't speak until she's sure. Harry caught Sherlock's eye from across the hall and gave a brief nod that meant she knows, I told her last night. Sherlock returned it. The red-haired boy, Ron Weasley, was looking at Sherlock with the uncertain expression of someone who wasn't sure whether to be impressed or suspicious and had landed somewhere between the two. From the staff table at the far end of the hall, Dumbledore watched all of this with the same warm, benign expression he'd worn since arriving in the sitting room the previous night. He was talking to a short woman in bright pink robes who seemed to be doing most of the talking, gesticulating with small sharp movements. She had the look of someone who had been granted authority recently and was still adjusting to the fit of it. Who is that? Sherlock asked McGonagall, who had positioned herself at the end of the nearest bench with a cup of tea. McGonagall followed his gaze. Her expression, which had been guardedly neutral all morning, did something specific. Dolores Umbridge, she said, in a tone that people use for words like infestation or subsidence. High Inquisitor. Appointed by the Ministry. She is here to inspect the school. Among other things. Ministry placement inside the school, Sherlock said. Reporting to whom? Cornelius Fudge. The Minister for Magic. McGonagall set her teacup down with a precision that communicated volumes. She has been systematically undermining the teaching staff and expanding her own authority since September. There is an educational decree system she's been using to, she stopped, recalibrated. She is not relevant to your investigation, Mr. Holmes. Everyone who holds institutional power in this building is relevant to my investigation, Sherlock said pleasantly. But I take your point that she's a secondary problem. He watched Umbridge laugh at something Dumbledore said, a laugh that looked like a performance of laughing rather than the genuine article. She'll become an obstacle. She already is one, McGonagall said flatly. After breakfast, Harry brought Hermione and Ron to the sitting room McGonagall had repurposed for them, and within approximately 90 seconds of sitting down, Hermione put a book on the table. It was large, bound in dark leather, its spine reading Wizarding Legal Statutes and Precedents, Volume 4, Criminal Proceedings and the Wisingamat, 1900 to 1990. She opened it to a marked page with the efficiency of someone who had been up since 5. Statute 14 of the Criminal Procedure Codes, 1947, she said. Every person accused of a criminal offense that carries a sentence of more than 1 year in Azkaban must receive a hearing before a full or partial Wisingamat panel before imprisonment. She looked up. Full stop. No exceptions. It's not discretionary. And Sirius never received one, Sherlock said. Never. I checked the Wisingamat records, they're archived in here for this period, she tapped the book, and there is no record of a hearing for Sirius Black. Nothing. Which means his imprisonment wasn't just unjust. It was illegal under wizarding law. Who was Minister for Magic in 1981? Sherlock asked. Millicent Bagnold, Hermione said. But the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the person who would have ordered the imprisonment, she paused, and the pause was significant, was Bartemius Crouch Sr. Sherlock turned this over. Crouch. The same surname as the Dr. Penelope Crouch who signed the death certificates. Hermione's expression confirmed she'd already made this connection. I think she might be a relative. Possibly his wife. So the man whose department signed the death certificates as part of the cover-up is the same man who ordered the illegal imprisonment. Sherlock stood and went to the window, looking out over the castle grounds, the grey lake below, the dark forest at the edge of the world. That's not coincidence. That's coordination. Crouch was obsessed with catching Death Eaters, Harry said. He was sitting with his arms on his knees, leaning forward, in the focused posture he'd had since last night. He's the one who gave Aurors permission to use unforgivable curses against them. He sent people to Azkaban without trials, there were cases. I've heard about them. He had this whole, he was supposed to be a good guy but he went too far. A man who believes the ends justify the means, John said. Yes. And ultimately the means destroyed him, his own son was a Death Eater. Bartemius Crouch Jr. Harry's jaw tightened briefly. I met him. Last year. He was part of why last year was difficult. He didn't elaborate and nobody pressed. Sherlock noted it and moved on. So we have Crouch Sr. orchestrating illegal imprisonments and coordinating with the MLE to bypass proper procedure, Sherlock said. We have Dumbledore present at the scene on the night of the murders, present at the child welfare placement, and present at every significant decision point with no accountability. And we have a ministry that celebrated Voldemort's disappearance so enthusiastically that it apparently forgot to investigate how 2 people were murdered in the process. He turned from the window. The question that interests me now is whether this was purely pragmatic, everyone so relieved the war was over that corners were cut, or whether the cover-up was deliberate and directional. Meaning was someone specifically trying to bury particular facts, John said. The trial question, Harry said. If Sirius had gotten a trial, Pettigrew's name would have come up. The question of who the actual secret keeper was would have been investigated. If investigators had properly looked at the night in Godric's Hollow, he paused. What would they have found? What are we not seeing yet? It was a good question. Sherlock had been circling it. There's a piece of the night itself that isn't in this folder, he said. We have before, the hiding, the protection. We have after, the placement, the imprisonments. But the night itself, the sequence of events, what actually happened in that house, we don't have testimony from anyone who was there. Hagrid was there, Harry said. He took me from the wreckage. Dumbledore was there, he arrived at Privet Drive with McGonagall. And, he stopped. There was someone else. Someone who was there before any of them. Who? John asked. Sirius. Harry looked at Sherlock. Sirius arrived at the house before Hagrid. He found my parents dead and he found me alive. He wanted to take me, he said he tried to take me. But Dumbledore had already sent Hagrid to collect me. How do you know that? Sirius told me. Third year. Harry's expression was working something out. Dumbledore had already sent Hagrid before Sirius arrived. Which means Dumbledore knew they were dead before Sirius got there. The room went quiet with the particular quality of quietness that settles when something that seemed like a question turns out to be an answer. He knew very quickly, Sherlock said. Fast enough to already have Hagrid in motion, Harry said. Which means either he was informed immediately by someone at the scene, or he was watching, Hermione said. She said it quietly, with the careful tone of someone who didn't want it to be true but couldn't stop it from being logical. Sherlock looked at her. Say more. There are monitoring charms. Complex ones, but, a headmaster of Hogwarts has access to observation magic that most wizards don't. It's in the school's charter going back centuries, connected to the wards. Hermione was choosing her words precisely. If Dumbledore had placed monitoring charms on the Potter house, not on Godric's Hollow itself, the Fidelius would prevent that, but on Harry, specifically, he would have known the moment something happened to Harry. He would have known immediately. He placed monitoring charms on a baby, Ron said, which was the first thing he'd said all morning and it came out flat and disgusted. That would explain the speed, Harry said. He was very still again. He had me watched. He knew before anyone else. He had time to set the narrative. To decide what would be investigated and what wouldn't. To have Hagrid there first, which meant Sirius couldn't take me. He paused. Sirius told me that day in the Shrieking Shack that it was the worst day of his life. Finding them dead and then having me taken away and not being able to, he couldn't argue with Dumbledore's orders in the middle of all that. His voice was factual, controlled. The window opened briefly again, just a crack. He was grieving. They both were. And Dumbledore used that. Nobody said anything for a moment. John was looking at his hands, then at Harry, with the expression he used when he wanted to say something human and was trying to figure out if this was the moment for it. Hermione closed the legal statute book and opened her mouth. She didn't get to speak, because the door opened. Not McGonagall this time. A large, broad-shouldered man with a great black beard that occupied an unreasonable amount of space in the doorway, in a moleskin overcoat of enormous dimensions, with kind eyes that were currently demonstrating a very different emotion than kindness. Behind him, slightly to one side, was a thin man who moved like someone accustomed to moving without being noticed, gray-haired, younger than he looked, with the quality of someone who had been damaged by time and hadn't entirely recovered from it. Sirius Black looked like a man who had been reconstructed rather than healed, the bones of who he'd been were there, the intelligence and the energy, but the 13 years had left their mark in ways that even freedom and decent food hadn't fully addressed. He looked at Harry first, immediately and completely, the way people look at the only thing in a room that matters to them. Then he looked at the folder on the table. Then he looked at Sherlock. "Your Holmes," he said. "Yes. You found the gaps." "There are quite a lot of them," Sherlock said. "Sit down, Mr. Black. We have significant ground to cover." Sirius sat, and Hagrid folded himself into a chair in the corner that was not built for him and managed it through a combination of goodwill and stubbornness, and looked at Harry with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not succeeding. "Hagrid," Harry said, not unkindly. "You carried me to the Dursleys." Hagrid looked as though he'd been expecting this and had been dreading it since the moment he walked in. "Dumbledore asked me to," he said, in his enormous voice, which had gone quite small. "He said it were necessary. He said you'd be safe there." "I know," Harry said. "I know you were doing what he told you." Hagrid swallowed. "I should've, it's not on you," Harry said firmly. Sirius was watching this exchange with his hands absolutely still on the table, which Sherlock suspected was an effort. He pulled the folder toward himself and began reading, and as he read the color of his expression changed, not flushing, the opposite, a gradual draining of the surface emotion to something underneath that was harder and colder and had been waiting for a very long time. He read the welfare record last. He set it down. "No trial," he said. "No trial," Sherlock confirmed. 13 years. Sirius's voice was remarkably even. "Not a single day in front of a Wisengamot panel. No evidence." "No," he stopped. Ran a hand through his hair in a gesture Sherlock clocked as identical to the one Harry used, which said something interesting about nature and environment given Harry had never known him. "I stood in that cell every day waiting. I thought eventually someone would come. That someone would ask. I knew Peter was alive. I knew what had actually happened. I kept thinking that someone would eventually investigate properly, and when they did," he looked at the table. "No one ever came." "Someone came eventually," Harry said quietly. Sirius looked at him. Then he looked at Sherlock. "What do you need from me?" "Your full account of the night of October 31st, 1981, Sherlock said. "Everything. The sequence of events, what you found, who was there, what was said. And after, your arrest, what happened, who ordered it, whether any statement was taken." He picked up his phone. "Do you mind if I record this?" Sirius looked at the phone with the mild incomprehension of someone for whom 13 years of Azkaban had created a technology gap and then waved a hand. "Whatever you need." He talked for 40 minutes. What emerged was not precisely a new story, the broad strokes were what Harry had known, but the details were the kind that changed the meaning of the broad strokes entirely. Sirius described coming to Godric's Hollow and finding the house destroyed, James dead in the hallway where he'd clearly tried to buy time without his wand. Lily dead in the nursery, positioned as though she'd thrown herself in front of Harry's crib. Harry in the wreckage of the crib, crying but alive, with a lightning bolt cut on his forehead that was unlike any wound Sirius had ever seen. "It wasn't a scar yet," Sirius said. "It was a wound. Bleeding. But the house was gone and the dark magic it was dissipating. I could feel it. Something had gone catastrophically wrong for Voldemort, and whatever had been in the house had left." He paused. "I'd already sent Peter to a different hiding place 3 days earlier. We'd switched, James and Lily agreed, Dumbledore agreed. Peter was the secret keeper." His voice was measured, clinical, the tone of someone who has told themselves this story so many times that the emotion has been worn smooth. "I went to find Peter. I confronted him in a Muggle street. And a muscle moved in his jaw. He was better than I gave him credit for. He blasted the street, killed 12 Muggles, cut off his own finger, and disappeared. And there I was in the middle of 12 bodies with a wand that had just been fired." He spread his hands. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It was so brilliantly, catastrophically stupid, and there was nothing I could do, and James and Lily were dead. I laughed, and the Aurors arrived and took me, and no one ever asked me a single question about what had actually happened." "Who oversaw your intake at Azkaban?" Sherlock asked. "Crouch's office. A junior official whose name I never got. No paperwork that I was shown. No," he stopped. "Nothing formal. It wasn't an arrest. It was a disposal. Crouch Sr. was acting on whose authority? Sherlock asked. The minister would have had to sanction. Bagnold was in the middle of the victory celebrations, Hermione said from across the table. She'd been writing notes the entire time Sirius spoke. The entire wizarding world was celebrating. The Minister for Magic had just thrown a party in Diagon Alley. Crouch acted quickly and quietly, and Bagnold either rubber-stamped it or wasn't asked. She looked up. And Dumbledore, who was the chief warlock of the Wisengamot at the time, would have had to call a hearing. He didn't. He was chief warlock, John said. He ran the court. Yes, Hermione said simply. Sirius had been watching Hermione with an expression that kept starting to be something and then pulling back. You're Granger, he said. Harry's written about you. He said you were terrifying. He said smart, Harry said. Terrifyingly smart, Hermione said, and went back to her notes without embarrassment. Sherlock stood and went to the window again. The grounds outside were beginning to show movement, students making their way to morning classes, a distant shape that might have been a large black dog in the direction of the Forbidden Forest, which was interesting. He turned back to the room. I want to talk about what Dumbledore's actual objective was, he said. Not his stated reason, the blood protection, keeping Harry humble. The actual strategic objective. He looked around the room. He believes, based on everything and how he's behaved, that Harry is necessary to a future confrontation with Voldemort. He believes this so completely that he's been curating Harry's life toward that end since 1981. The placement with the Dursleys was not just about the protection. It was about control. Raising Harry away from the wizarding world meant Harry arrived at Hogwarts without alliances, without knowledge, without the kind of confidence that comes from growing up knowing your own history. He looked at Harry. He wanted someone who would trust the guidance of a mentor completely. Someone without enough information to question the plan. Harry held his gaze. He wanted a soldier who didn't know he was being trained. Yes. The words sat in the room. And the prophecy, Hermione said, carefully. Harry's expression shifted slightly. What prophecy? Sherlock asked. A beat. Harry looked at the table, then back at Sherlock. There's a prophecy. I only found out about it last year. I'm not going to go into the full details right now, but essentially it concerns Voldemort and me. Dumbledore has known about it since before I was born. And he didn't tell you until last year, Sherlock said. He's been making decisions based on it for my entire life, and I didn't know it existed until, Harry stopped. Until someone died because of it. The window was open again, the rawness underneath the composure, and then it closed. It's why he needed me shaped a certain way. The prophecy says I'm the one who has to face Voldemort. He's been preparing me for that since before he left me on the Dursleys' doorstep. Without asking you, John said, in the tone he'd used before. Without telling me it was happening, Harry said. There's a difference, but both of them are wrong, John said. Plainly, without drama. Just stated, the way a doctor states a diagnosis. Sirius was looking at the table with an expression that suggested he was doing significant work to stay in the chair rather than doing something less productive. His hands were very still again. I want to be in the room when you confront him properly, Sirius said. You will be, Sherlock said. But not today. Today I want to build the complete case. By the time we sit across from Dumbledore and make this formal, I want every piece of it documented and accounted for. I want him to have no room to reframe it or redirect it. He looked around the room. He's an exceptional strategist. He'll come at this with multiple angles, the necessity argument, the greater good argument, the love argument. He genuinely believes his own reasons, which makes him more dangerous than a simple liar. A simple liar can be cornered with facts. A man who has justified himself so completely that the justification has become belief, he paused. That requires something different. What? Harry asked. We take away the architecture, Sherlock said. All of it, piece by piece, in sequence, until the only thing left is what was actually done and to whom. He looked at Harry. And then you stand in front of him and you don't let him make it abstract. You make it personal. Your parents. Your godfather. Your childhood. Every time he tries to make it a strategy problem, you bring it back to the specific human cost. Harry nodded slowly. You think he can be held accountable? I think we're going to find out, Sherlock said. Which requires us to go higher than Dumbledore. Higher than the school, higher than the ministry's current structure. He picked up his phone and looked at it. I have a call to make. John looked at him. Mycroft. Mycroft. Sherlock said the name with the specific mix of resignation and necessity that it always carried. Your brother? Harry asked. My significantly more irritating brother, yes. Sherlock was already dialing. He works for the British government in a capacity that he never fully explains to anyone, including officially. He has known about the wizarding world for some time. I know this because he knew the name of the street this school's supply shop is on without me telling him, 2 years ago, in a conversation about something entirely different. He filed it then. It tells me that whatever arrangement exists between the British government and the wizarding government, Mycroft is part of it. The phone rang twice and was answered on the third ring, which was 2 rings longer than usual and communicated deliberate nonchalance. Sherlock, said Mycroft Holmes, in the tone of a man who had been expecting this call and had decided to sound as though he hadn't. You know why I'm calling, Sherlock said. A pause of precisely the length that indicated confirmation. You're in Scotland. I'm in a castle you've known existed for at minimum the 6 years you've been in your current position and quite probably longer. Sherlock went to the corner of the room, not for privacy. Everyone in the room was already hearing everything, but because he thought better when he could move in a small space. The Statute of Secrecy. The arrangement between the British government and the Ministry of Magic. How long has it been in place? Another pause. Longer. Since 1692, Mycroft said, with the faint exhalation of a man deciding to stop pretending. The International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy. The British government has operated under a parallel agreement since then. There is a liaison structure. It's quite well organized. And the deaths of James and Lily Potter in 1981. The Somerset Constabulary Report, the signed-over jurisdiction, the complete absence of any Home Office involvement in a double homicide on British soil. Sherlock kept his voice even. That went through your liaison structure. Silence. Mycroft. The ministry requested jurisdiction, Mycroft said carefully. The Home Office at the time, rubber-stamped it without question and closed the file. Sherlock let that sit. I need you to do 2 things. The first is to locate and confirm the status of the child welfare record for Harry Potter, whether any follow-up assessment was ever conducted, which it wasn't, and to formally document that the placement was made without legal sanction. From a Muggle legal standpoint. And the second? I need access to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's records from October and November 1981. Sherlock could feel Mycroft's expression through the phone, the specific calibration of calculation against instinct. You have a liaison. The liaison has access. I need those records. Sherlock, what you're describing would require, Mycroft. Sherlock's voice went quieter, which was always more effective than louder. 2 people were murdered. A man was imprisoned for 13 years without trial. A child was deliberately deprived of his legal guardian and placed in an unsupervised care arrangement for 10 years. On British soil. By people who are still in positions of authority. A pause. We both know that if any of this had happened in the Muggle world, it would have been front-page news and 3 parliamentary inquiries. The only reason it isn't is because a treaty made in 1692 has been used to place an entire parallel society outside the reach of accountability. His voice was flat and certain. I'm going to change that. You can help where you can observe from the side. But you cannot stop it. A very long silence. In the room Harry, Hermione, Ron, Sirius, and Hagrid were all watching Sherlock with varying degrees of astonishment. "I'll make some calls," Mycroft said finally, which for Mycroft was the equivalent of anyone else saying "I'll move mountains and call in every favor I have." "Sherlock. Be careful." "I'm always careful." "You are never careful." "You are frequently effective, which is different." A pause. "The headmaster of that school is not a man to underestimate." "Neither am I," Sherlock said, and ended the call. He turned back to the room. Sirius was looking at him with an expression that had shifted over the course of the last 10 minutes from guarded assessment to something resembling genuine respect. Hermione had 4 pages of notes. Ron was staring at the phone with the expression of someone who kept encountering the non-magical world and finding it simultaneously less and more impressive than expected. Hagrid, in the corner, had been quiet for a long time. He spoke now, in a voice gone rough. "What happens to Dumbledore?" he asked. "When all this," he gestured at the table, the folder, the morning's entire architecture. "When it all comes out proper. What happens to him?" "That depends on what he did," Sherlock said. "And on what can be proved." He's not a bad man," Hagrid said. The line between his eyebrows was deep and troubled. He's a man who made choices he believed were necessary and didn't consider what they cost the people those choices were made about," John said, with the gentleness he reserved for things that were true but painful. "That's not the same as a bad man. But it's not a good man either." Hagrid looked at his hands. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose it isn't." Harry was looking at the folder on the table. He'd been looking at it in that periodic way all morning, returning to it the way you return to something that has changed its weight since you last held it. He reached out and put his hand flat on the cover of it. "Hermione," he said. "If we were going to force a formal inquiry, something that couldn't be buried or delayed, what would we need?" Hermione looked up from her notes. "A formal petition to the Wisengamot, signed by a qualifying party, which can be any magical person of age, or a legal guardian of a minor with standing, which means Sirius." She looked at Sirius. "Once you're officially reinstated as Harry's guardian, which requires a summary hearing to establish wrongful imprisonment." She was building the structure as she spoke, fast and sure. "Combined with a parallel complaint to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, ideally from an external source, which could be me," Sherlock said. "Through Mycroft's liaison office, as a representative of the British government with standing in the cross-jurisdictional agreement." Hermione blinked. "That would actually work," she said, with the tone of someone encountering a solution that was elegant without being obvious. "It would require the Ministry to acknowledge the jurisdictional agreement publicly," Sirius said. "Fudge won't want that." "Fudge won't have a choice," Sherlock said. "Once it's filed, it's on record. You can't unfile a formal complaint. You can delay it, obfuscate it, attempt to discredit it, but you can't make it not exist." Harry stood up from the table. Not abruptly, he stood the way he'd been doing everything this morning, with a quiet, decisive energy that had been building incrementally since the previous night and had now reached a temperature where it needed to move. "Then let's build it," he said. "Hermione, what do you need?" "Books, records, specific documents. The Wisengamot archives from 1981 to 1984, she said immediately. Any records of the Crouch Department's processing during that period. The original Hogwarts enrollment records, specifically who authorized Harry's placement as a ward under school protection. And," she paused, "the prophecy record, if it's been registered with the Department of Mysteries. Prophecies that affect living individuals are required to be registered." Harry looked at her for a second. "You knew about the prophecy before today." "I suspected there was one," she said, carefully. "The way Dumbledore has always talked about your destiny. The pattern of it." She met his eyes. "I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure and I didn't want to," it's fine, Harry said. We'll get the record. He turned to Sirius. I need you to write a formal account. Everything you told us this morning, in your own hand, as a sworn statement. Can you do that? Sirius looked at him with the expression he'd been fighting all morning, the one that kept trying to be something more than what the moment allowed for. Yeah, he said, roughly. Yeah, I can do that. Good. Harry picked up the folder and looked at Sherlock. And Dumbledore? We confront him today, Sherlock said. Not to expose him yet, to show him the shape of what we have and watch how he responds. The way a person responds to evidence tells you as much as the evidence itself. He put his coat on. Where would he be at this time of morning? His office, Harry said. He's always in his office. They went up through the castle in a group, Harry and Sherlock side by side, John just behind, Hermione with her notebook, Sirius with his hands in his pockets and the particular loose readiness of a man who had been in enough dangerous situations to know what the feeling before one felt like. The stone staircases moved around them, staircases that shifted direction mid-climb without warning, portraits watching them pass with expressions ranging from curious to alarmed. A ghost drifted through a wall, stopped upon seeing the group, and drifted back through with the haste of something that had decided it didn't want to be involved. Harry stopped in front of a stone gargoyle on the 6th floor and said a word that Sherlock didn't catch, and the gargoyle stepped aside. The staircase beyond it spiraled upward to a heavy wooden door. Harry knocked. Come in, said Dumbledore's voice, warm and unhurried, the voice of a man who had been expecting this visit as well. They filed in and the office unfolded around them, a circular room full of silver instruments that turned and glinted, portraits of previous headmasters along the walls, and at the center desk, Dumbledore, looking precisely as he had the night before, with the addition of a small bird perched on a stand nearby that regarded them all with bright intelligence. He looked at Sirius Black, and something moved through his expression, genuine surprise, quickly managed, and underneath the surprise, something more complex. Sirius, he said. I'm glad you're safe. I want to know, Sirius said, stepping forward, his voice carrying the particular quality of a man who has been quietly furious for 13 years and is choosing his words with surgical care, why there was no trial. I want to hear you say it. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. His hands were folded on the desk. He looked at Sirius and then at Harry and then, for a long beat, at Sherlock. Because a trial, he said, very carefully, would have raised questions about the sequence of events on Halloween 1981 that I was not prepared to answer publicly. The silver instruments turned and clicked. You knew Pettigrew was the secret keeper, Harry said. It wasn't a question. Dumbledore looked at him. I had strong reason to suspect it, yes. In the hours after the attack. And you let Sirius go to Azkaban anyway. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside the window the Scottish morning was going grey at its edges. I was managing a situation, Dumbledore said, that involved considerations beyond any single individual. You keep saying that, Harry said. You keep making it about the big picture. But Sirius is right there. He didn't raise his voice. And my parents are in a folder downstairs. And I slept in a cupboard for 10 years. He took a step forward. I'd like you to try making it small. Just for once. I'd like you to look at it the way it actually was instead of the way you've arranged it in your head. Dumbledore looked at him for a long, silent moment. The bird on the stand made a soft sound. The portraits on the walls were very still. You are very much like your mother, Dumbledore said quietly. She could always, don't, Harry said. Quietly. Absolutely. Don't tell me about my parents. You don't get to tell me about my parents anymore. You've been telling me about them since I was 11 and every version has been the version that was useful to you. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. I'm going to find out who they actually were. Not your version. The silence stretched. Then Sherlock said, very calmly, we're filing a formal petition with the Wisengamot. A cross-jurisdictional complaint through the British government's liaison office. A request for summary proceedings to establish wrongful imprisonment. He looked at Dumbledore without hostility, without performance, simply with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who has already decided how this ends. I thought you should know. Not to ask your permission. Simply as a courtesy. Dumbledore looked at him. The warmth was still there, the composure, the intelligence. But underneath all of it something had shifted, the recognition, clear and unambiguous now, that the game he had been running for 40 years had encountered something it wasn't designed for. Not a more powerful player. Something different. A player who didn't want power. Just answers. I see, Dumbledore said. Yes, Sherlock said. I thought you might. Chapter 4, Britain demands answers. The petition was filed on a Thursday. Mycroft's liaison, a precise, unremarkable woman named Evelyn Cross who wore sensible shoes and carried a briefcase that contained, Sherlock suspected, the kind of paperwork that could quietly reshape governments, arrived at Hogsmeade on Wednesday evening and spent 3 hours in a sitting room with Sherlock, Hermione, and Sirius's sworn statement. She read everything twice without expression, asked 14 questions, each one sharper than the last, and then closed her briefcase and said, "This will go through the cross-jurisdictional agreement under Article 7, subsection 3. The Ministry of Magic will have 48 hours to respond before automatic escalation to joint inquiry." Hermione looked at her with the expression of someone encountering a bureaucratic equal for the first time. "You've used Article 7 before." "Once," Evelyn Cross said. 1975, a rather unpleasant business involving a Muggle village in Dorset and a memory charm that went wrong. She stood. "This is considerably larger." She looked at Sherlock. "Your brother sends his regards and says you owe him 3 favors." "I owe him nothing," Sherlock said. "He's been waiting for an excuse to do this for years." Evelyn Cross did not smile, but something around her eyes suggested she agreed. She left, and the petition went with her, and the following morning it arrived simultaneously at the British Home Office and at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's intake desk in the Ministry of Magic, delivered by 2 owls who showed up at exactly the same moment from opposite directions, which Hermione said was almost certainly not a coincidence and Sherlock said was absolutely not. By Thursday afternoon, the Ministry of Magic was on fire. Not literally. Though Ron, upon hearing the description of the activity in the ministry's corridors from Sirius's contact inside the building, said it sounded like it might as well be. The contact was a woman named Nymphadora Tonks, or, recently qualified, related to Sirius through a family tree he described with the resignation of a man who had complicated feelings about his family tree, who sent a message via Patronus that materialized in the corridor outside the sitting room as a small, silver wolf and said, in a voice that was rapid and delighted and trying very hard to be professional, "The petition hit Fudge's desk at 9 this morning and he's been in emergency meetings since 10. Umbridge has been in and out of his office every 40 minutes. Someone leaked it to the Prophet, front page tomorrow, they're saying." Amelia Bones asked for a full copy of the documentation at noon. She read it in her office in one sitting and hasn't come out since. Thought you should know. Also, Sirius, please don't do anything that gets you arrested before you're officially cleared, it would ruin the paperwork. The wolf dissolved. Sirius stared at the space where it had been. "She always says that," he said, to no one in particular. "She's not wrong," John said. "She's very rarely wrong," Sirius said, with the specific tone of a man who found this both admirable and exhausting. Sherlock was already at the window with his phone out, typing a message to Mycroft that said only profit tomorrow. Move the Home Office statement to Friday morning. The reply came back in 4 seconds, already scheduled. Also, you owe me 4 favors now. The 4th is for not saying I told you so. Sherlock put the phone away. Harry came in from the corridor, where he'd been for the past hour doing something that required privacy, and his expression had a quality to it that Sherlock had learned to read over the past days, the particular stillness of someone who had been working something through alone and had arrived somewhere. "I spoke to Lupin," Harry said. The room shifted slightly. Sirius looked up. He's coming, Harry continued. Tomorrow morning. He said, he paused. He said he should have done something sooner. He said that in a letter. 3 paragraphs of it, actually. Remus is good at guilt, Sirius said, with the complicated fondness of someone who had known a person for 30 years. He's been carrying it since 1981. He was their friend, Harry said. He knew them. Both of them. He looked at the folder on the table, which had not moved from that spot in 3 days. I want, when this is over, when the formal proceedings are done, I want to actually talk to people who knew them. Not in a case context. Not as witnesses. He looked at Sherlock briefly. Just talk. That's entirely reasonable, Sherlock said. I know it's reasonable, Harry said, mildly. I'm just saying it out loud. Ron appeared in the doorway behind him with a copy of that evening's Evening Prophet Extra, a special edition, apparently, because the headline was in letters large enough to read from across the room, shocking petition filed, Potter's deaths, black imprisonment under formal inquiry below it, in slightly smaller letters, Ministry of Magic faces cross-jurisdictional complaint. British government involved. Full details, page 1 to 4. Hermione took the paper from Ron before he'd fully extended his arm and read it standing up, lips moving slightly. Her expression moved through several stages, analytical, concerned, sharply alert, and then she lowered the paper and said, "They've got most of it right. Someone gave them the broad outline of the petition. Not the specific documents." She looked at Sherlock. "Who leaked it?" "Someone who wanted public pressure in place before the ministry could manage its response," Sherlock said. "The ministry cannot bury a story that is already on the front page." "You leaked it," Harry said. "I provided a factual summary to a journalist I trust to use it accurately and promptly," Sherlock said. "Rita Skeeter is not that journalist," he added, because Hermione had opened her mouth with an expression suggesting that name was incoming. "Who then?" Ron asked. "A non-magical journalist named Catherine Marsh, who covers institutional accountability for the Times and who has been cultivating sources in government liaison offices for 11 years. Sherlock picked up the paper and scanned it. "She has also filed the Muggle version of the story, which will run tomorrow with specific reference to the child welfare failures and the Somerset Constabulary report. It will be considerably less mystifying to the average reader than references to Azkaban and the Wizengamot." John, who had been quiet for a few minutes, said, "So by tomorrow morning it's in both worlds." "Simultaneously. Which means neither world can respond to it as though it's purely the other world's problem." Sherlock set the paper down. "The ministry cannot dismiss it as a Muggle matter. The Home Office cannot dismiss it as a wizarding matter. They both have to answer." Harry was looking at the Evening Prophet headline. His expression was hard to read, not distressed, not triumphant, somewhere in the particular territory between those two things where significant events actually live. "It's going to be strange," he said. "In school tomorrow. Everyone reading this. You're already strange to them," Ron said, with the unfiltered honesty of a long friendship. "Famous strange, not bad strange." "Helpful, Ron, thank you," Harry said. "You know what I mean." Ron sat down. "Half of them already think Dumbledore can do no wrong. The other half," he paused. "Well. After last year, after everything Umbridge did in his name," he glanced at Harry. "More people might be ready to hear it than you think." This was, Sherlock noted, the most politically astute thing Ron Weasley had said in 4 days, which suggested there was considerably more underneath the affable exterior than the exterior advertised. The Great Hall the following morning had the specific energy of a place where everyone had read the same thing before arriving and was now performing the act of not talking about it, which is always louder than actually talking about it. Copies of the Daily Prophet were on every table, folded and refolded and passed between hands. The headline was different from the Evening Prophet Extra but no less significant: "Sirius Black, the trial that never was formal inquiry launched as British government cites 1692 treaty. Dumbledore named in petition. The name hit the hall like a dropped stone hitting still water, the ripple of it visible in how conversations stopped, in how heads turned toward the staff table, in how several students looked at the headmaster's chair and then quickly looked away. Dumbledore was not at breakfast. McGonagall sat in his place at the center of the staff table with the expression of someone who had expected this and had decided to meet it with absolute composure. Umbridge was 2 seats down from her in a set of particularly aggressive pink robes, reading the prophet with a color in her face that suggested her blood pressure was doing something inadvisable. Harry came in and sat down, and the hall noticed. Not obtrusively, there were no dramatic gasps, but the quality of attention in the room adjusted, the way attention does when the subject of every conversation walks into the space where the conversation is happening. He sat between Ron and Hermione and poured pumpkin juice and picked up a piece of toast and did all of this with a deliberate ordinariness that Sherlock, watching from the side door where he and John had paused, recognized as a conscious choice. "He's been doing that for years," John said quietly. "That, the not performing. Deliberately doing ordinary things when everyone is watching to see what extraordinary thing he'll do." "Yes," Sherlock said. "He learned it early. What you learn to do when you're constantly observed and have no power over the observation is to make the observation unrewarding." He watched Harry talk to Ron, gesture at the prophet, eat his toast. "It's quite good armor." "It's sad armor," John said. Sherlock looked at him. "Yes," he said, after a moment. "It is." The morning moved quickly after that. Amelia Bones arrived at the castle at 9:30. Sherlock had researched Amelia Bones in the 2 days since her name had first surfaced. Head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Former Auror. A reputation for procedural correctness that was apparently so consistent it had become almost legendary in the Ministry's corridors. She had prosecuted Death Eater cases after Voldemort's first fall with the rigor that Crouch had used as a blunt instrument, the difference being that Bones had actually held trials. Every single one. Even the ones where the guilt was obvious. Even the ones where it would have been quicker and easier not to. She walked into the sitting room where Sherlock and John and McGonagall were waiting, and she was not what the dry description in Mycroft's briefing note had suggested. She was a solid woman in formal navy robes, with close-cropped hair and a monocle that she wore with the absolute lack of self-consciousness of someone who had worn it for decades and stopped noticing that anyone might find it remarkable. She shook Sherlock's hand with a grip that said she had no interest in subtlety and sat down without waiting to be invited. "I've read the petition 3 times, she said. "I want to hear it from you." "All of it?" Sherlock asked. "The gaps," she said. "I know the official record. I've been looking at the official record for years and knowing something was wrong with it and not being able to find the specific wrong thing." Her jaw was set, her eyes direct, her voice the voice of someone who had spent their career in rooms where people tried to obscure things and had become very efficient at cutting through the obscuring. "Show me the specific wrong thing." Sherlock showed her. He walked her through it the same way he'd walked Harry through it, but faster. Bones was not a 15-year-old encountering this for the first time, she was a legal professional who had been circling the same territory from the other side, and she moved through the documentation with the speed of someone filling in blanks they'd always known were there. The ME report drew a sharp breath through her nose. The child welfare record made her jaw tighten. Sirius's sworn statement she read with complete stillness, and then she set it down with the care of someone handling something that has significant weight. "A summary hearing to establish wrongful imprisonment," she said. "As the precondition for reinstating him as Harry Potter's legal guardian, which establishes Harry's standing in the Wisengamot petition," Sherlock said. "That can be convened within 48 hours under emergency summary provisions." She was already making notes. "Fudge will object." Fudge's objections are on record as of this morning in 2 newspapers on both sides of the statute of secrecy, Sherlock said. "His capacity to manage this quietly is already compromised." Bones looked at him with the first trace of something that wasn't pure professional assessment, something that might be satisfaction or might be relief or might be both, occupying the same space. You did that deliberately. The press exists for exactly this purpose, Sherlock said. When institutions fail their function, public record becomes the substitute function. The ministry isn't going to, the ministry cannot put this back in the box, Ms. Bones. It's a cross-jurisdictional complaint co-signed by the British Home Office. The statute of secrecy doesn't shield against that. The treaty specifically preserves the British government's right to investigate criminal matters affecting its citizens that originate in the magical world. He met her gaze. Your ministry agreed to that treaty in 1692. We're simply using it. Bones looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, the summary hearing will be Monday. I'll convene it myself. She stood, straightening her robes. I'll want the documentation formally submitted to my office by 5 o'clock today. It'll be there at 4, Hermione said from the corner, which was the first thing she'd said since Bones arrived, and Bones looked at her with the particular attention of someone encountering a very good mind in an unexpected location. You're a student, Bones said. 5th year, Hermione said. But the legal research is sound. I can provide citations for every statutory reference in the petition. Bones looked at Sherlock. Is she always like this? Apparently, Sherlock said. Good, Bones said, and left. Harry had been standing in the doorway for the last part of this exchange, having arrived quietly partway through. He looked at Sherlock. Monday, he said. Monday. He nodded. Then he said, Dumbledore's called an assembly. Tonight. In the Great Hall. He held up a notice that had appeared on every common room board simultaneously, written in the calm, blue ink of someone who had decided to control the narrative by addressing it directly. He wants to speak to the school. Of course he does, Sherlock said. Should I be there? Where else would you be? Sherlock said. The Great Hall that evening had a different quality from breakfast, fuller, stiller, the candlelight doing what candlelight does in large stone spaces, which is make everything feel simultaneously warm and serious. All 4 house tables were full. Teachers lined the walls. Umbridge had positioned herself to Dumbledore's left with the expression of someone who had claimed a territory. Dumbledore stood at the front and looked out at 600 faces looking back at him, and he did not look diminished. This was the thing about him that Sherlock had been cataloguing since the first evening. The man had a quality of presence that was not diminished by difficulty. If anything, he seemed to grow slightly more defined under pressure, the way certain materials do. Sherlock stood at the back with John. Harry was at the Gryffindor table with Ron and Hermione, and Sirius was somewhere in the castle doing something that McGonagall had been informed about and had chosen not to ask specifics on. Students, staff, Dumbledore began. His voice carried without effort, the way voices carry when they've been filling large rooms for decades. You will have read this morning's papers. I imagine many of you have questions. He paused. I would like to address them honestly. John leaned toward Sherlock. He's going to reframe it, he murmured. Watch his hands, Sherlock said. Dumbledore's hands were at his sides, relaxed, open, the gesture of a man presenting himself as having nothing to hide, which was a choice rather than a natural state. The petition that has been filed raises legitimate questions, Dumbledore said, and the word legitimate was doing considerable work in that sentence, acknowledging the questions while simultaneously characterizing them as already within the bounds of what he was willing to discuss. Questions about decisions I made in very difficult circumstances, in the aftermath of one of the darkest periods this world has known. I made those decisions with the information I had and the resources available to me and in the service of what I believed would best protect the people in my care. The hall was very quiet. Not the silence of agreement, the silence of people listening carefully, which is a different thing. Sirius Black, Dumbledore said, and the name moved through the room. I want to be clear about this. The question of Sirius's trial is one I have asked myself many times. He paused. I was wrong not to demand one. That is a failure I carry. It was, Sherlock noted, elegantly constructed. Not a full admission, I was wrong not to demand one placed the failure in the passive register, made it a thing he failed to do rather than a thing he chose not to do. The difference was everything. But my wrongness in that matter, Dumbledore continued, does not change the fundamental truth of the darkness we were all facing. The decisions I made about Harry's upbringing were made in the full knowledge that Voldemort's defeat was not permanent. Could you tell us about the prophecy? Harry said. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just clear, from the Gryffindor table, in the specific quality of voice that cuts across a space when the rest of the space is quiet. Every head turned. Dumbledore looked at Harry. His expression was complicated and human and, Sherlock thought, genuinely moved in some way, because Harry asking it publicly, in front of the school, was something Dumbledore had not expected. He had expected private conversation. Managed disclosure. He had not expected this. Harry, a prophecy about me, Harry said. He stood up, which was not a theatrical gesture, just the natural result of the conversation requiring it. Made before I was born. That you've known about since before my parents were killed. That shaped every decision you made about my life. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. The school has been reading the papers. They deserve to know the context. He paused. And so do I, fully, in public, where it can't be quietly revised later. The silence in the hall had gone very specific. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long time. In the looking there was something that was not calculation, something older and more genuinely painful than that. The expression of a man who had, perhaps for the first time, the precise measure of what his careful management had produced. Not the humble, trusting soldier he'd intended. Someone considerably more formidable. There is a prophecy, Dumbledore said, to the hall. It was made in 1980 by Professor Trelawney, in this school, and I was the only witness. It speaks of a child born at the end of July to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times, who would have the power to defeat him. He held Harry's gaze. It was this prophecy that caused Voldemort to target the Potter family. And it was the knowledge of this prophecy that informed my decisions about Harry's upbringing. You could have told me at 11, Harry said. At 12. At 13. His voice was not angry. It was precise. You chose not to. That was a choice, not a necessity. You were a child, you made decisions for a child about that child's life, Harry said, and then continued making them when the child was old enough to be told. He didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't perform anything. Professor Dumbledore, I don't think you're a bad person. But I think you decided a long time ago that being right was the same as being just, and it's not. He paused. The inquiry on Monday will establish what actually happened in 1981. I want the school to know that I asked for it. Not to hurt you. Not for revenge. Because my parents deserved better than to be a footnote in someone else's plan, and Sirius deserved better than 13 years without a trial, and I deserved to know the truth about my own life. The hall was silent enough that the candles were audible. Then Neville Longbottom, from the middle of the Gryffindor table, started clapping. It was slow at first. Neville had the round, serious face of someone who had arrived at a decision after considerable thought, and when he clapped it was the deliberate clap of conviction rather than impulse. Then Ron. Then Hermione, who had tears on her face that she didn't bother wiping. Then the spread of it through Gryffindor, uneven at first, then broader, and within 30 seconds it had moved across the hall in the specific way that things move across a crowd when they hit something true. Not every student. Not quite. There were faces at the Slytherin table that held back, faces in Hufflepuff that looked uncertain. But the majority of 600 people in a stone hall in Scotland were applauding a 15-year-old who had just stood up and said something that needed saying, and the sound of it against the stone and the high ceiling was remarkable. Dumbledore stood at the front and let it happen. He did not speak over it. He did not raise a hand to quiet it. He looked at Harry across the full length of the great hall with an expression that Sherlock, even at the back of the room, could read clearly. The expression of a man watching something he had built for a specific purpose revealed that it had outgrown the purpose entirely. After the assembly, the corridors were loud. Not chaotic, the particular loud of 600 people all needing to discuss the same thing simultaneously and trying to do so at a reasonable volume. Sherlock moved through it with John and found the side corridor where Harry had gone, following the instinct that Harry would need the quiet more than he'd admit. He was standing by a window that looked out over the dark grounds, one hand on the cold stone of the sill. He heard them coming and didn't turn immediately, which meant he'd known it was them from the footstep rhythm. He was already that good at reading his environment. That was not part of the plan, Sherlock said. No, Harry said. He turned. His expression was tired but not troubled. But it needed to be said in a room where it couldn't be managed. A pause. Dumbledore would have shaped the narrative of Monday's hearing in whatever way he could. Now there are 600 people who heard the question put plainly and who heard him acknowledge the prophecy. He can't revise that. Sherlock looked at him for a moment. You used the audience. I used the truth, Harry said. The audience was just, he gestured at the window, at the castle, at the particular institutional reality of being a famous person inside a small closed world, already there. John was smiling slightly. You know, in different circumstances, you'd make a very good detective. Harry looked at him, and there was the faintest trace of something that was almost a real smile. In different circumstances, he said, I'd make a very good a lot of things. They went back through the castle, through the corridors full of buzzing conversation, past the portraits who were having their own version of the discussion in animated whispers, past Peeves the poltergeist who was bouncing off the ceiling in a state of delighted agitation that had nothing to do with them specifically and everything to do with the general atmosphere of upheaval. In the entrance hall, they nearly walked into Umbridge. She was standing at the foot of the main staircase with two students Sherlock didn't recognize, larger ones, 5th or 6th year, with the specific look of people who had been cultivated as instruments, and she was looking up the staircase with the expression of someone who had been deciding something. She turned when they arrived, and the smile she produced was the same smile Sherlock had noted at breakfast, the one that looked like a smile from the outside but functioned like a warning. Mr. Holmes, she said. Her voice was soft and sweet in the way that certain poisons are colorless. I don't believe we've been formally introduced. We haven't, Sherlock said. You're the High Inquisitor. You've been attempting to have me removed from the school since yesterday morning through communications with Minister Fudge that you're conducting from the headmaster's private fluke connection when Professor Dumbledore isn't using it. He smiled at her pleasantly. You haven't succeeded, if you were wondering about the status of those attempts. Her smile didn't falter. It was a remarkably durable smile. I'm sure I don't know what you're referring to. I simply wanted to introduce myself and to mention that the presence of unauthorized civilians in a school is subject to Educational Decree, 23. Sherlock said. Which grants the High Inquisitor authority to remove non-educational personnel. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a single sheet of paper, which he held out to her. Home Office authorization, countersigned by the Ministry of Magic's Liaison Office, confirming my status as an official investigator under the cross-jurisdictional agreement. He smiled again. I'm not unauthorized, Ms. Umbridge. I'm the most authorized person in this building at the moment. She looked at the document. Something moved through her expression that was not the smile. Her eyes went to Harry, briefly, with the specific expression she reserved for Harry, a particular dislike that had history behind it, that Sherlock had been noting since first observing her. How lovely, she said, and the word landed like a small, precise stone. You'll find, Mr. Holmes, that institutions have ways of protecting themselves. Yes, Sherlock said. That's rather the problem we're here to address. She left, her shoes clicking a precise rhythm on the stone floor, the two students trailing behind her like unhappy satellites. Harry watched her go with the expression of someone keeping score of something. She'll do something, he said. She'll try to, Sherlock said. She's a ministry operative in a school that's about to become the center of a very public inquiry. Her incentive is to disrupt this before Monday. He looked at the staircase. Which means we need Monday to come faster than she can move. He took out his phone and sent Mycroft a message, Umbridge. Dolores. Ministry High Inquisitor at Hogwarts. Confirm scope of her authority under educational decree system. Specifically whether any decree can override cross-jurisdictional authorization. The reply took longer than usual. 7 minutes, which for Mycroft was an eternity and meant he was actually checking rather than simply knowing. When it came back it said, no decree in the educational system supersedes the 1692 treaty provisions. However, she could attempt to have the treaty provisions themselves challenged on grounds of emergency ministerial authority. Fudge signed Emergency Powers Order 94 in February. Check the scope. Sherlock showed it to Hermione, who had appeared from somewhere in the direction of the library with a book under each arm. She read it, and her expression did something sharp and unhappy. Emergency Powers Order 94 gives the Minister for Magic the authority to suspend cross-departmental proceedings in cases of active national security threat. She looked up. He could argue the inquiry constitutes a threat to institutional stability during the return of Voldemort. He could argue that, Sherlock said. Can he make it stick? Not if the Home Office files the Muggle parallel proceedings simultaneously, Hermione said. He can suspend the wizarding side but he can't touch the Muggle side. She looked at Sherlock. Which means we need the Muggle proceedings to move first. Catherine Marsh's story runs tomorrow morning, Sherlock said. The Home Office has a press statement scheduled. If Mycroft moves the formal Muggle side proceedings filing to tonight, he was already typing. Tonight is Friday, John said. Mycroft doesn't sleep on principle, Sherlock said. Move the Muggle proceedings filing to tonight. Marsh story tomorrow guarantees public record exists before any emergency powers invocation. Fudge cannot suppress what is already in the Times. The reply came back in 40 seconds, done. You owe me 5 favors. I'm keeping a list. Harry had been reading over Sherlock's shoulder for the last part of this exchange with the expression of someone watching a different kind of chess game being played at a different kind of speed. You and your brother, he said. You don't get on. We get on extremely well, Sherlock said. We simply express it through mutual leverage and professional antagonism. My family is less, Harry stopped himself. Well. I suppose the Weasleys shout a lot but they mean it kindly. Sentiment expressed through volume, John said, nodding. That's the Weasley idiom, from what I've seen. What's yours? Harry asked John. John thought about it. Sentiment expressed through showing up, he said, after a moment. Which is probably the best idiom if you're choosing. Harry looked at him, and something in his expression acknowledged this in a way that was quiet and genuine and didn't need elaboration. Sirius showed up, Harry said. He came when I wrote. He didn't ask questions or make conditions. He just said tell me when and where. He looked out the entrance hall's high windows at the dark outside. I've been thinking about that. Don't overthink it, John said. Some things just mean what they appear to mean. They went upstairs, and the castle settled around them into its nighttime sounds, the portraits quieting, the staircases slowing, the particular deep stillness that very old stone buildings develop after midnight, as though they're remembering all the previous nights they've held. In the sitting room, Sirius was waiting with Lupin, who had arrived while the assembly was happening. Remus Lupin was thin and graying and looked, as Harry had described him, like someone who had been through considerable difficulty without adequate rest. He was sitting with his hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold, and when Harry walked in he stood with the involuntary movement of someone who has been waiting for something and has just seen it arrive. He looked at Harry. Then at Harry's face, specifically, for a long time. You look like both of them, he said quietly. Harry looked back at him. Everyone always says the eyes, Harry said. It's more than the eyes, Lupin said. The way you held yourself just now, coming through that door. That was James. But the way you were looking at me, deciding what to do with what I said, he paused. That was Lily. The room was still. Sirius was looking at the middle distance with an expression of controlled emotion that was the most human Sherlock had seen on his face. I should have, Lupin began. Don't, Harry said, gently. Not tonight. We've got Monday first. He sat down. Tell me something real about them. Not from a case perspective. Just, something real. Lupin sat back down slowly. He thought for a moment, and then the ghost of something that might once have been a ready smile moved across his face. Your mother once hexed Severus Snape's shoelaces to tie themselves together every time he tried to take a step, he said. For a full week. She did it the day after he called her, after he said something unforgivable, actually, something I won't repeat, and she spent a week watching him lurch and trip in the corridors, and she never once looked directly at him while he was doing it. Just looked straight ahead. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, good. Sirius let out a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost, but underneath it something rawer, grief surfacing in the way it does when a happy memory finds its way in. She was extraordinary, Sirius said. Your mum. He looked at Harry directly. She'd have taken apart every one of these documents herself if she'd been here. She'd have been terrifying. Harry absorbed this. Yeah, he said quietly. I think so too. Outside, the Scottish night was very dark and very clear, and in London the Times was already printing, and at the Home Office a document was being time-stamped at 11:47 p.m., and somewhere in the Ministry of Magic a filing owl was arriving at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's after-hours intake with a formal complaint that had the specific gravity of things that have been a long time coming. The machine was in motion. Monday was 3 days away and Cornelius Fudge had not slept. Neither, across town, had Dumbledore, who sat in his circular office with the silver instruments turning and the portraits pretending to sleep, looking at a point on the wall with the expression of a man who has run the same calculation 4 times and gotten the same answer each time and has not yet decided what to do about it. The answer being, this cannot be stopped now. Only shaped. And for the first time in a very long career, Albus Dumbledore was not certain he was the best person to do the shaping. Chapter 5. The weight of every choice. Monday arrived the way important days always do, looking exactly like an ordinary one until you were already inside it. Harry woke at 5:30 to grey light coming through the dormitory window and the specific quality of silence that meant everyone else was still asleep. He lay there for a few minutes looking at the ceiling, which had a water stain near the corner that he'd never noticed before in 4 years of sleeping under it. He noticed it now. He thought about what Sherlock had said about noticing things and how the difference between seeing and observing was just a question of intention. He got up quietly, dressed, and went down to the common room. Hermione was already there, sitting in the armchair nearest the fire with 3 books open on the table in front of her and a 4th in her lap, making notes with the focused efficiency of someone who had perhaps been there since 4. She looked up when he came down the stairs. Summary hearing at 10, she said. Amelia Bones confirmed the panel last night. 3 Wisengamot members, Griselda Marchbanks, Tiberius Ogden, and Edgar Hopkirk. None of them Fudge's people. How'd she manage that? Harry asked, dropping into the chair across from her. She didn't give Fudge advance notice of the panel composition until this morning, by which point it was already filed and confirmed. Hermione had the expression of someone encountering a truly elegant procedural maneuver. She used a provision that allows the head of the MLE to convene summary hearings independently of ministerial approval in cases involving potential wrongful imprisonment. She paused. Fudge is furious, apparently. Good, Harry said. He's also issued a statement saying the cross-jurisdictional complaint is under review and may be subject to emergency powers suspension. She looked at him steadily. But Sherlock got ahead of it. The Times story ran this morning with the Home Office filing timestamp, and Mycroft's office released a statement at 6 a.m. saying any attempt to invoke emergency powers against a treaty-based complaint would constitute a breach of the 1692 agreement and would be treated as such by the British government. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning Fudge would be starting a diplomatic crisis with the Muggle government on top of everything else. She closed one of the books. He backed down at 6:30. No emergency powers invocation. Harry stared at the fire. Sherlock planned all of that. He and Mycroft together, Hermione said. I think they're more alike than Sherlock admits. He'd hate that, Harry said. Enormously, Hermione agreed. Ron came down at 6, then Neville, who had been quieter than usual since the assembly but present in the specific way that Neville had been present all year, steady and serious and growing into something that hadn't been entirely visible before. He sat on the end of the sofa and looked at the fire and said, without preamble, my parents were in Azkaban too. Not wrongfully. But because of people like Crouch. Because the system was broken. He looked at Harry. I want you to know I understand why this matters. Harry looked at him. I know you do. Neville nodded and went back to looking at the fire, and that was the entirety of it, which was exactly the right amount. Sherlock and John appeared at 8 from the direction of the guest rooms McGonagall had maintained for them, Sherlock looking as though he'd either slept 4 hours or 20, it was impossible to tell, and John looking like a man who had drunk his coffee and was ready for whatever the day brought. They ate breakfast quickly and functionally, and then they were in McGonagall's office with the documents and Hermione's organized files and Sirius, who arrived 5 minutes late with a slightly wild quality to his energy that suggested the last 72 hours had been running on something less reliable than sleep. How do you feel? John asked him. Like I'm about to get my life back, Sirius said. Terrifying, actually. That's appropriate, John said. Lupin came in behind Sirius. He'd been at the school since Friday night, staying in his old office at McGonagall's quiet invitation, and he'd spent the weekend in a specific way, talking to Harry in the evenings, not about the case, about his parents. Long conversations that Harry reported only in fragments but that were visibly doing something to the quality of his expression, softening some edge that had been there since the beginning. Tonks arrived from the ministry via Flu at 8:15 in a set of aura robes that were regulation navy except for the lime green scarf she'd tucked into the collar, and she shook everyone's hands with the rapid energy of someone whose natural pace was faster than most situations required. She was assigned by Amelia Bones to liaise between the hearing and Hogwarts, she explained, because Bones wanted someone she trusted outside the ministry building during the proceedings, watching the exterior response. What does that mean, exterior response? Ron asked. It means someone watching to see who tries to leave the ministry in a hurry when the hearing starts, Tonks said. Someone intercepting Owl's scent in the first half hour. Someone making sure no documentation gets quietly moved between now and when the panel asks for it. She sat down. Institutional proceedings always have an external dimension. Bones knows that. You've done this before, Sherlock said. I've done pieces of it, Tonks said. Never the whole thing. Never anything like this. She looked at Sirius with the particular look she reserved for him, which combined affection and exasperation in a proportion that had clearly been established over years of knowing him. You look terrible. Thank you, Nymphadora. Don't. Dora. Better, she said, and it was the entire dynamic of their relationship compressed into 4 words. At 9:30, they gathered in the entrance hall. The group that walked out of the castle and down to the carriages that McGonagall had arranged was larger than any of them had quite consciously assembled: Harry, Sherlock, John, Sirius, Lupin, Hermione, Tonks, and McGonagall herself, in her most formal dark green robes, carrying a leather document case with the compressed authority of someone who had been waiting a long time to carry it. The morning was sharp and clear. The lock was flat and silver. As they walked, Harry fell into step beside Sherlock, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything, the silence companionable rather than empty. What does the hearing actually accomplish? Harry asked eventually. It establishes formal legal record that Sirius's imprisonment was unlawful, Sherlock said. Once that's on record, his status as your guardian is reinstated, which gives you independent legal standing in the Wizengamot. It also formally requests the MLE records from 1981, which will expose Crouch's role in the procedural failures. And, he paused, it creates a public precedent that the ministry cannot simply imprison people without trial and expect institutional silence to hold. That last one is bigger than serious, Harry said. Yes. Serious is the case. The precedent is the point. Harry considered this. Dumbledore will be at the ministry. He's already there. He arrived this morning, I was told. Sherlock glanced at him. You're ready for this. I know, Harry said. It wasn't arrogance, it was the same quality he'd had since the first night in the sitting room. The certainty of someone who has stopped performing readiness and simply arrived at it. The Ministry of Magic's visitor entrance on a Monday morning had the energy of a place braced for something. The security wizard at the front desk, a broad-shouldered man with very little interest in being at work, checked their wands and papers with the exhausted efficiency of someone who had already had a difficult morning, and when Sirius presented his temporary clearance document, issued by Bones's office at 6 a.m. under summary provisions, the man looked at it for a long time and then looked at Sirius and said nothing, which was more respectful than anything he'd said to anyone else that morning. The lifts were busy. The atrium was full. And people noticed Harry the way they always did in the wizarding world, that particular quality of public recognition that was different from celebrity in the Muggle sense, more personal and more freighted, the recognition of someone whose history was woven into your own. Heads turning, conversations pausing, a child tugging a parent's sleeve. Harry walked through it the way he walked through everything, looking forward, unremarkable in his own movement, giving the attention nothing to catch on. Hermione had noted that they'd be passing through the atrium on the way to the courtrooms and had anticipated exactly this. She walked half a step behind Harry's right shoulder in a way that was both protective and practical, creating a physical buffer without making it obvious. Tonks did the same on his left. Sherlock found this interesting without commenting on it. The courtroom they'd been assigned was not the main chamber, that was the large tiered room used for full Wisengamot sessions. This was a summary hearing room on the 4th floor, smaller and plainer, stone walls and wooden benches and a central table rather than the theatrical pit and gallery arrangement of the main chamber. Amelia Bones was already there, standing near the panel's table with the focused neutrality of someone in full professional mode. The 3 panel members, Marchbanks, a tiny ancient woman with eyes like chips of flint, Ogden, heavy-set and rumpled, who looked like he'd been pulled from something else at short notice, and Hopkirk, younger than the other 2, with careful hands, were arranging documents. Fudge was also there. He was standing to the side of the room with 2 ministry officials Sherlock didn't recognize, in his characteristic lime green bowler hat and the expression of a man who has decided to observe rather than participate while maintaining the option to intervene if things went badly. He looked at Harry when they came in with the expression he always seemed to produce for Harry, an uncomfortable mixture of deference and resentment that had developed in direct proportion to how unavoidable Harry had become. He looked at Sirius with something less complicated. Just discomfort, clean and simple. Then he looked at Sherlock with the expression of someone who had read the papers and the Home Office statements and was attempting to categorize a new kind of problem. Sherlock looked back with no particular expression at all, which he'd found was generally more unsettling than any expression would have been. Dumbledore was at the far end of the room, seated, in robes of deep burgundy, with his hands in his lap. He looked up when Harry entered and their eyes met across the room, a long look, direct and clear, carrying the full weight of everything that had passed since Tuesday evening in the sitting room, since the assembly on Friday night, since the office on Wednesday morning. A look between 2 people who understood each other clearly and disagreed fundamentally about what was important. Harry broke it first. Not out of discomfort, he simply had things to do. Sirius sat at the central table with Hermione to his right and Tonks to his left. The panel convened at 10:05. Griselda Marchbanks, who appeared to run the room on the quiet authority of extreme age and complete indifference to anyone's opinion of her, called the hearing to order in a voice that was small and carrying and entirely uninterested in ceremony. Summary hearing, case reference MLE 1981-1103-B. Sirius Oran Black, imprisoned November 1981 without trial, charge of betrayal of the Fidelius Charm protection of James and Lily Potter and the murder of 13 muggles in a public location. She looked up. We have the petition. We have the sworn statement of the accused. We have the cross-jurisdictional complaint filed by Mr. Sherlock Holmes, authorized under the 1692 treaty provisions. We have a request from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's current head, she looked at Bones, for the original case records from 1981. She set her papers down. Let's begin. Mr. Black. Sirius stood. He gave his account. Sherlock had heard it 4 times now, the switch of secret keepers, the confrontation with Pettigrew, the arrival of the Aurors. Each time it had the same structural clarity, the story of someone who has told the truth so many times in conditions where no one was listening that the truth has become entirely unadorned. No performance. Just sequence. He spoke for 20 minutes and when he finished, Marchbanks asked 3 questions, each one surgical, and Sirius answered each one without hesitation and without embellishment. Then the panel asked for the original case records. Bones produced them, or produced what remained of them, which was the point. The original MLE file on the Black case, obtained from the archives that morning, was thin. Improbably, deeply thin. 3 pages. An intake record, a transfer document to Azkaban, and a notation of the charge. Where there should have been witness statements, investigative records, evidence logs, spell analysis, there was nothing. Marchbanks looked at the 3 pages for a long time. This, she said, is the entirety of the file. Yes, Bones said. For a case involving 13 Muggle deaths and the alleged betrayal of a protected location in a time of war. Yes. Marchbanks set the 3 pages down with the precise movement of someone placing an important object in a specific position. Mr. Crouch, she said. Bartemius Crouch Sr. His department processed this case. Yes, Bones said. Is Mr. Crouch available to give evidence? Mr. Crouch is, Bones paused, and the pause had a complicated texture, deceased, as of last year. His death is under separate investigation. The name of Crouch SNR and the manner of his death was something Harry had been present for in ways that were still officially unexplained, and Sherlock had noted the careful neutrality with which Harry had tracked this exchange. Marchbanks made a note. She looked up. Mr. Dumbledore. Dumbledore stood. He had been sitting throughout the proceedings with the still composure of someone who has decided how they're going to conduct themselves and is maintaining it with the discipline of long practice. He stood and he looked at the panel with the same warmth and gravity that he brought to everything. You were Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot in November 1981, Marchbanks said. I was. You had the authority to convene a summary hearing for Mr. Black within 48 hours of his imprisonment. I had that authority, yes. Why didn't you? Dumbledore was quiet for just a moment, the pause of a man who has prepared for this question and is now deciding which prepared answer to use. The circumstances following Voldemort's defeat were extraordinary, he said. The magical world was in a state of profound disruption. The priority of the ministry and of my own office was the identification and prosecution of Death Eaters who remained at large, the restoration of order and safety, and the welfare of the many families who had suffered losses. He paused. In the midst of that, the matter of Sirius Black's trial was, another pause, allowed to proceed on the assumption that the case was clear. That was an error of judgment. Whose assumption? Marchbanks asked. My own, Dumbledore said. And that of Bartemius Crouch Sr. You communicated directly with Crouch about this case. We discussed the situation. And the decision not to convene a trial was made in those discussions. A long pause. It was not a decision, precisely. It was an, Professor Dumbledore, Marchbanks said, with the small, carrying voice that filled the room without effort. This panel has no interest in the vocabulary of justification. Did you and Bartemius Crouch Sr. decide, in communication with each other, that Sirius Black would not receive a trial? The room was absolutely still. Dumbledore looked at Marchbanks. Then, with the careful movement of someone putting something down after a long time of carrying it, he said, "Yes." The room received this. Fudge made a small sound near the wall that was not a word. The reason, Dumbledore continued, before Marchbanks could ask it, was that a trial would have required public disclosure of the Fidelius charm, its secret keeper, and the events of Halloween night in a level of detail that he paused, believed would have compromised other ongoing security considerations. Security considerations, Marchbanks repeated. Involving the child, Harry Potter. Yes. Marchbanks looked at Dumbledore for a long moment. Then she looked at Harry, who was sitting behind the table, and her expression shifted slightly, the flint chip eyes doing something complicated with what they found in Harry's face. "The panel will take a 20-minute recess," she said. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Harry stood against the wall and looked at the ceiling and breathed. John stood next to him, not saying anything, which was the right call. Sherlock was 3 steps away, reading something on his phone, which was also the right call. Sirius came out into the corridor and stood on Harry's other side, and none of the 3 of them spoke for almost a minute, which was the specific quality of silence between people who understood what had just happened and didn't need to translate it. Then Sirius said, very quietly, he admitted it. "Yes," Harry said. "In a formal hearing. On record." "Yes." Sirius exhaled. It was a long breath, uneven at the edges. 12 years waiting for that. 13, Harry said. 13. Sirius looked at the corridor wall. "Still feels like it happened to someone else a bit." "It happened to you," Harry said. Firmly, without drama. Just a fact he wanted on record between them. Sirius looked at him. The expression on his face was the one he'd been managing all weekend, too large for the available space, carefully contained. He put a hand briefly on Harry's shoulder, just for a moment, and then let it go. "Yeah," he said. "It did." Lupin appeared from further down the corridor and stopped when he read the 3 faces. "He admitted it," he said. "On record," Sherlock confirmed. Lupin put a hand over his mouth briefly. He looked at the wall, then at Sirius, then at Harry. Then he sat down on one of the wooden benches that lined the corridor and put his elbows on his knees and was quiet for a moment, and in that moment you could see everything he'd been carrying since 1981 without any of it being spoken. The doors to the courtroom opened again and the clerk beckoned them back. The panel delivered its finding at 11:47 a.m. Griselda Marchbanks read it in the same small, carrying voice, without ceremony or drama, which was the most appropriate possible way to deliver it. This panel finds that the imprisonment of Sirius Orion Black, November 1981, was unlawful. No trial was held. No evidence was formally assessed. No statutory provisions for emergency detention were invoked. The imprisonment was conducted in violation of Statute 14 of the Criminal Procedure Codes, 1947, and constitutes wrongful imprisonment under both wizarding law and the cross-jurisdictional provisions of the 1692 treaty. She set the paper down. This panel further finds that the conduct of former MLE head Bartemius Crouch Sr. in processing the imprisonment without trial was a serious breach of statutory duty. This finding is referred to the MLE's Internal Review Board and to the Cross-Jurisdictional Records Office. She looked up. Sirius Orion Black is hereby legally exonerated of all charges. All warrants and orders issued against him are voided as of this date. Compensation proceedings will be initiated by the MLE. A pause. The panel additionally notes, for the formal record, that the Chief Warlock's acknowledgement of deliberate decision-making regarding Mr. Black's trial is a matter that will require further proceedings of its own nature. She looked directly at Dumbledore. This panel would advise Professor Dumbledore not to leave the country. She gathered her papers and stood, and the room moved. It moved in the way rooms move when something significant has just been formally made real, not a dramatic rush, but a recalibration, everyone adjusting to the new fact that now existed and would continue to exist regardless of anything else. Fudge was talking rapidly in a low voice to his officials. The two panel members were murmuring to Bones. Tonks had her hand over her mouth with an expression that was very close to tears but was fighting them on professional grounds. Sirius sat at the central table for a moment without moving. Just sat. Then Hermione, who was sitting next to him, put her hand over his on the table, which was the right thing at the right time, and Sirius looked at her with an expression of surprise that was immediately softened by something else. Harry was looking at Dumbledore. Dumbledore had risen from his chair and was standing with a stillness that was different from the stillness he'd had all morning. The composure was still there, the warmth was still there, but something had shifted underneath, the specific shift that happens when a person has been preparing for a reckoning and the reckoning has arrived and is exactly as real as they'd feared. He looked at Harry. Harry crossed the room and stopped in front of him. Behind Harry, Sherlock and John watched without intervening, and this was right. This was a moment that didn't need a witness other than itself. "I want to talk to you," Harry said. "Not here. Not in the hearing. Just us." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "My office at the Ministry. It's available." It was a small room 3 floors up, functional, impersonal, the room of someone who spent most of their time somewhere else. Dumbledore sat behind the desk and Harry sat across from it, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Harry said, "I've been trying to figure out whether you love me or whether I'm a piece on your board. And I keep coming back to the same problem." Dumbledore was quiet. "I think both are true," Harry said. "I think you do love me, in whatever way you're capable of loving people whose existence is primarily useful to a larger plan. I think it's real. But I also think that when they've been in conflict, when it was a choice between what was good for me and what was good for the plan won every time." He looked at Dumbledore steadily. "My parents' deaths. Sirius's imprisonment. The Dursleys. Every year at Hogwarts where something terrible happened and you were managing it. Shaping it." He paused. "I'm not a symbol, Professor. I'm a person. I always was." Dumbledore looked at him with an expression that had lost several of its usual layers. What was underneath was not villainous. Sherlock had been right about that. It was something more complicated than villainy. An old man looking at the cost of the choices he'd made and finding that accounting more difficult than the strategic intelligence that had made the choices seem necessary. "The greater good," Harry said. The phrase sat differently in this small room than it had in any of the public settings of the past week. "You believe in it." "I believe," Dumbledore said carefully, "that some costs, borne by individuals, prevent greater costs borne by many." He paused. "I have believed this for a very long time." "What does it cost you?" Harry asked. Dumbledore looked at him. "When you make those decisions. When you choose the greater good over the specific person. What does it cost you personally?" Silence. "Because I want to understand," Harry said, and there was something in his voice now that was neither accusation nor forgiveness, something that was simply the genuine desire to see clearly. "I want to understand how a person decides that a 15-month-old on a doorstep in November is an acceptable cost. Not because you're a monster. Because you're not. Which makes it harder to understand, not easier." Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. "It costs more than you might believe," he said finally. "Every choice costs. The accumulation of," he stopped. Started again. "I have made decisions involving great cost to individuals because I could see, or believed I could see, the larger shape that those decisions served." He looked at his hands. "And I have told myself, for 40 years, for longer, that the ability to see that larger shape was a gift. An obligation. That someone had to hold the long view when others could not." He paused. "It is only recently that I have wondered whether the long view was also, in part, a protection. Whether the ability to make everything strategic was also a way of not having to feel the weight of the specific." Harry said nothing. "The specific being," Dumbledore said quietly, "a child on a doorstep. A man in Azkaban without trial. Two people who were 21 years old. He looked at Harry. Your parents were exceptional. James was, he paused, reckless and brave and funnier than he had any right to be. And Lily was, she was the most naturally gifted which I have encountered in 60 years of teaching. He held Harry's gaze. They deserved to live. Not as instruments of a prophecy. As people. The room held this. That's the first time you've said that, Harry said. Without it being in service of something else. Dumbledore acknowledged this with the small movement of someone receiving an accurate observation. It doesn't change what happened, Harry said. No, Dumbledore said. It doesn't. It doesn't change the inquiry, or Monday, or what comes next. No, Dumbledore said again. Nor should it. Harry looked at him for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to keep going. Through whatever the Wisengamot proceedings are. Through all of it. Not to destroy you. He was precise about this, clear, and Sherlock would later think this was the most important thing Harry Potter had said in the entire week. Because accountability isn't destruction. It's just, what should have happened. What should always happen when someone in authority causes harm, regardless of the reason. Dumbledore was quiet. I also need you to stop making decisions about my life, Harry said. All of them. I'm 15. I know about the prophecy now. I know what's coming. You don't have to manage how I know it or protect me from it. He looked at the older man steadily. I'd rather have the truth and be frightened by it than have a comfortable version and walk into it blind. You are, Dumbledore said, with something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same space, extraordinarily like your mother. People keep telling me that, Harry said. I'm starting to think it's the best thing anyone can say to me. He stood, and as he stood Dumbledore also stood, not a formal gesture, something else, the natural rising of someone in the presence of something that has earned a standing acknowledgement. Professor, Harry said, at the door. Dumbledore looked at him. The next time you know something I should know, Harry said, tell me. He left. The corridor outside was where Sherlock and John were waiting, and Harry walked out with the expression of someone who has done a difficult thing thoroughly and is neither proud nor relieved about it, just done with it. Well? John asked. He's sorry, Harry said. I think he genuinely is. He walked toward the lifts. It doesn't fix anything. No, John said, falling into step beside him. But it's true. Yeah. Harry pressed the lift button. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it. Nothing, Sherlock said, from his other side. It belongs to him. You don't have to carry his remorse. Harry looked at him. Is that from experience? Sherlock considered this. People are always trying to give me their guilt to hold. I've learned to leave it where it's placed. The lift arrived and they got in, and as the doors closed Harry said, what's next? Formally. The full Wisengamot proceedings, Sherlock said. The formal inquiry into the conduct of Dumbledore, Crouch Senior's department, and the Ministry's handling of the 1981 case. That will be scheduled within the week, now that the summary hearing is done. He looked at Harry. You'll be required to testify. In front of the full Wisengamot. Yes. How many people is that? 50 on the panel, Hermione said, appearing at the back of the lift where she had somehow already been. Plus a public gallery. The proceedings are open. Harry looked at the lift doors. Right, he said. Then, fine. The lift reached the atrium and the doors opened and they walked out into the light, and the atrium was still full of ministry workers and their conversations and the business of an institution that was attempting to function normally around the significant abnormality of everything that had happened this morning. People looked at them as they crossed the atrium, at Sirius, walking free and exonerated through the same building that had processed his illegal imprisonment, and at Harry, who walked beside him with the specific quality of presence that had been there since the beginning, that Sherlock had catalogued on the first night in the sitting room. Not loudly famous. Not performing significance. Just there, in the full sense of the word, present and awake and paying attention in a way that most people aren't, which was something Sherlock recognized because it was something he valued in the few people who had it. Tonks caught up with them near the visitor exit. Bones wants to schedule the full inquiry for Thursday, she said. She's moving fast on purpose, before anyone has time to build counternarratives, Sherlock said. Right. She looked at Sirius. How are you doing? Sirius walked through the visitor exit into the London street outside and stopped in the actual, physical, non-magical London morning and tipped his head back and breathed. Ask me later, he said, to the sky. Lupin, coming out behind him, put a hand on his shoulder and left it there. The street around them was ordinary London going about ordinary Monday, buses and black cabs and the distant machinery of a city that had no idea what had just happened 3 floors underground in a building disguised as a condemned department store. People walked past them on the pavement, none of them looking up, all of them ordinary and continuous and real. Harry stood on the pavement and looked at the city going past and then looked at Sherlock. Thursday, he said. Thursday, Sherlock confirmed. And I have to stand in front of 50 Wisengamot members and the public gallery and tell the truth, Sherlock said. Clearly and without performance. The truth is sufficient. Everything we've built this week is sufficient. He looked at Harry. You've already done the harder part. What's the harder part? Finding out, Sherlock said simply. Harry was quiet for a moment. A bus went past. A pigeon landed on the pavement near them, assessed the situation, and left. I keep thinking about them, Harry said. Not sorrowfully, something more active than sorrow. My parents. Who they were. What they'd think about this week. He looked at the street. Sirius said my mum would have been in that courtroom. He said she'd have had a file thicker than Hermione's. He almost smiled. I believe him. I do too, John said. I never got to know them, Harry said. That's, whatever happens Thursday, whatever the inquiry does, that's the thing that doesn't get fixed. They're still gone. He said it without the weight of an announcement, just as a fact he'd been carrying. But I know more about who they actually were now than I ever did when I only had Dumbledore's version. He looked at Sherlock. That's because of you. Sherlock looked at him. In his calculation of this case, in the 8 days since the package had arrived through the letterbox at Baker Street, he had processed a considerable volume of information. He had constructed the architecture of the deception in full, dismantled each section with documentary precision, navigated 2 governments and 1 ancient magical institution, and had arrived at this Monday pavement on the other side of it with a case that would continue in its formal dimensions for weeks but was, in its essential shape, complete. He had not calculated for this particular moment. He was occasionally surprised to find that human moments occasionally outran his calculations. Your parents, he said, and he was careful and specific about it, were real people. They made a choice to fight and were killed for it by a man who found them because someone who was supposed to protect them betrayed them. Everything else, the institutional failures, the deliberate cover-up, the managed narrative, that was built on top of their actual story, which was simple and human and does not require any interpretation. He met Harry's eyes. You know their story now. Not Dumbledore's version. The real one. What you do with it from here belongs entirely to you. Harry held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and turned and looked at the street again. Behind them, Sirius was still standing with his face tipped up toward the London sky, and Lupin had his hand on his shoulder, and Hermione was already consulting her notes about Thursday, and John was watching all of it with the expression he wore when the world was demonstrating something worth watching. From somewhere above them an owl arrived, not from the direction of Hogwarts but from somewhere else, and it landed on a post box near Harry and offered its leg, and Harry took the letter it carried. He read it, and his expression did something that was hard to name, a quiet, brief opening and closing. Bones, he said. She's confirmed Thursday and she says, he reread it, she says the panel will include a formal record of the child welfare failure. The Desley placement. It'll be part of the official findings. Good, Hermione said immediately. Harry folded the letter. He put it in his pocket. He looked at the city around him, the ordinary, enormous, completely indifferent city, and something settled in his face that had not been settled when Sherlock had first seen him walk through the sitting room door a week ago. Not happiness. Something quieter and more durable than happiness. Clarity, perhaps. The specific kind that arrives when things have been seen as they actually are. Thursday then, Harry said. Thursday, Sherlock said. And the London morning continued around them, indifferent and continuous and entirely unaware that it had just become the background of something that mattered. Chapter 6. What Justice Looks Like. Thursday arrived cold and bright, the kind of November morning that had no interest in being symbolic but was anyway, sharp air, hard light, everything stripped back to its actual outlines. Harry was up at 5 again. This time Sherlock was already in the common room when Harry came down the stairs, sitting in the armchair nearest the fire with his coat still on and his eyes on the middle distance and the particular quality of stillness about him that meant he was either thinking very hard or had been thinking very hard for several hours and had arrived somewhere. A cup of tea sat on the table beside him, cold and untouched. Harry looked at the tea. How long have you been down here? Since 2, Sherlock said, without moving. Thinking about the hearing? Thinking about the anonymous letter. Sherlock looked at him. I know who sent it. Harry sat down in the chair across from him. The fire had burned low and neither of them reached to add wood. Who? Minerva McGonagall, Sherlock said. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then, you've known for a while. Since the second day. She looked at the folder the way people look at things they've seen before. Sherlock turned the cold cup of tea in his hands without drinking it. She'd been carrying copies of those documents for years. Waiting for the right person to send them to. She chose me because I operate outside institutional loyalty. I have no reason to protect the Ministry, no reason to protect Dumbledore, no investment in the status quo of either world. He paused. She also chose the timing carefully. This year specifically, after what happened last year, after the things Harry was put through, she decided enough was enough. She never said anything, Harry said. She said everything, Sherlock said. In the documents she chose. In the note she wrote. In the way she met us at the door and put us in the sitting room with the fire already lit. He looked at the dying fire. She's been at that school for decades. She's watched Dumbledore make these decisions and told herself he knew best and then watched you come back every year with new damage and told herself it was necessary, and at some point this year she stopped being able to tell herself that. Harry was looking at the fire. She never said a word. About any of it. To me. Because saying it to you, without evidence, without the machinery to do something with it, would have been cruelty. She needed someone who could do something. Sherlock finally set the cold tea down. She's been protecting you in the only way she had available. For years. Harry was quiet for a long time. The fire made small sounds. Somewhere in the castle something shifted, a staircase rerouting, probably, the castle's endless nocturnal rearrangements. I'm going to tell her I know, Harry said finally. I thought you might, Sherlock said. After today would be the appropriate moment. Yeah. Harry looked at his hands. After today. The word today sat between them with its full weight. Walk me through it one more time, Harry said. What happens in the hearing? Sherlock walked him through it. The structure of the full Wisengamot proceedings, the panel of 50, the public gallery, the formal order of evidence. The documentation would be presented first, the witnesses called in sequence. Amelia Bones had structured the proceeding to move chronologically, the events of Halloween 1981, then the immediate aftermath, then the institutional decisions, then the long-term consequences. Harry would testify last, which Bones had decided deliberately. Not because his testimony was least important but because it was most important and she wanted everything else established as bedrock before it. She's smart, Harry said. She's exceptionally good at her job, Sherlock said. She thinks in structures the way I think in patterns. The result is similar. What do I actually say? The truth. Your version of it. Sherlock looked at him. Not the legal version, not the evidentiary version, those have already been handled. Your testimony is the human dimension that the documents can't carry. What it was like to be the child in the welfare record. What it was like to grow up not knowing. What it felt like to find out. He paused. Don't perform it. Don't manage it for their comfort. Just tell them what it actually was. I'm not good at, Harry stopped. Actually, I think I might be okay at that. I know you are, Sherlock said. Harry looked at him with the look he used when he was genuinely curious about something. Do you believe in justice? As a concept? Sherlock considered this honestly. I believe in accuracy, he said. I believe that when things happen, they should be recorded accurately and responded to accurately. Whether that constitutes justice depends on what you expect justice to look like. He looked at Harry. What do you expect it to look like? Harry thought about it. I used to think it would feel like winning, he said. Like something being restored. Like getting back what was taken. He shook his head slightly. But my parents are still dead. Sirius still lost 13 years. I still spent 10 years in that house. He looked at the fire. So now I think maybe justice just looks like, the truth being on record. Formally. In a place where it can't be revised or buried again. He paused. And people who caused harm being seen doing it, in public, where everyone can look. That's a sophisticated definition, Sherlock said. I've had a sophisticated week, Harry said. From upstairs came the sounds of people beginning to move. The castle was waking up around them, footsteps, the distant sound of the great hall beginning to fill, the particular morning sounds of 600 people starting a day. They sat with the dying fire for another few minutes without speaking, which was its own kind of preparation. The Ministry of Magic's main Wisengamot chamber was full when they arrived at 9. Not just the 50 panel members, the public gallery, which wrapped the upper level of the chamber in a horseshoe of wooden benches, was packed with more people than Sherlock had seen in any judicial setting. Witches and wizards of every description, many of them with the Daily Prophet folded under their arms, all of them carrying the specific quality of public attention that descends on proceedings when the public has decided the proceedings matter. Which was exactly what the previous week had been designed to produce. The press section was full. Sherlock noted the Daily Prophet's 2 reporters in the front row, a woman from the Quibbler with a slightly unfocused expression that might have been whimsy or might have been intelligence with unusual packaging, and 3 non-magical journalists, including Catherine Marsh from the Times, who gave Sherlock a brief nod when he entered that contained a week's worth of professional satisfaction in approximately 1 centimeter of head movement. The panel was already seated when they arrived. 50 men and women in plum-colored robes, arranged in the tiered semicircle above the main floor, Griselda Marchbanks at the center with her flint-chip eyes taking in the packed gallery with the total calm of someone for whom large rooms full of watching people were entirely routine. Fudge was in the gallery. Not on the floor, he had been explicitly excluded from any active role in the proceedings by Bones, who had made this decision on the grounds that the Minister for Magic's own conduct in the handling of recent matters was potentially subject to review and his presence in an active capacity would constitute a conflict. He sat in the gallery looking like a man wearing his lime green bowler hat as the last remaining symbol of an authority that was very rapidly being reviewed from multiple directions. Umbridge was not present, which Sherlock noted with interest. Tonks, when asked, said she'd been told Umbridge had taken sudden leave as of that morning. Tonks said this with an expression of uncomplicated satisfaction. Dumbledore sat in the witness area on the chamber floor, in dark grey robes that were the quietest thing he'd worn all week. Beside him, across the aisle, Sirius sat in a chair that was simply a chair rather than the chain seat used for accused parties, a detail that Bones had specified with deliberate symbolism, and which several members of the public gallery had noticed and discussed before the proceedings opened. Harry came in last. He came in with Sherlock and John on one side and Hermione and Ron on the other and Lupin a step behind, and the gallery noticed in the way the gallery had been noticing him all week, that adjustment of attention, that collective recognition. He walked to the witness preparation area on the left side of the chamber floor, sat down, and looked at the panel with the same direct, unremarkable quality he'd been bringing to everything since Tuesday. Ron sat beside him and said, very quietly, "You know you're going to be fine." "I know," Harry said. "Just making sure you knew I knew," Ron said. "Deeply helpful," Harry said, and the faintest smile crossed his face and disappeared. Griselda Marchbanks called the proceedings to order. What followed was 3 hours of the most methodical evidentiary construction Sherlock had observed in any legal setting, magical or otherwise. Amelia Bones presented the documentation in sequence, each piece building on the last with the patient precision of someone who had spent 40 years understanding that the best argument is the one that doesn't need to be an argument because the facts have already made it. The Me Report. The Somerset Constabulary Records. The Child Welfare Document. The Wisingamot Archive showing the absence of any hearing for Sirius Black. The 3-page MLE file, which drew a visible response from the gallery when its thinness was displayed and its inadequacy was enumerated. The panel asked questions in rotation. Not hostile questions, the questions of people following an argument carefully and clarifying as they went. Marchbanks asked the sharpest ones. Ogden, the rumpled one who'd seemed like the most uncertain member of the panel, turned out to ask the questions that cut deepest into the structural failures rather than the individual ones. How had this been allowed to persist? What oversight mechanisms had failed? What institutional design had made this level of unaccountable decision-making possible? These were the questions that mattered beyond the case itself, and Bones answered them with the directness of someone who had been building to exactly this conversation. Crouch Sr.'s role was addressed formally, posthumously, through document and witness testimony. His legacy was precisely dismantled, not with malice, but with accuracy, which was more effective. A man who had believed his own righteousness so completely that he'd used it to bypass every procedural protection he was responsible for upholding, and who had, in doing so, created a system in which innocence was no protection because guilt was never formally established. The panel noted this with the specific gravity of people who would be recommending structural reforms in their findings. Then Dumbledore was called. He walked to the witness stand with the composure he'd had throughout, not diminished, not performing. Just Dumbledore, which was its own complicated thing. He took the honesty oath with the steady hands of someone who had already decided to be honest, and when Marchbanks began the questioning, he answered with the same quality he'd brought to Monday's summary hearing. Directly. Without the usual layers. He confirmed the decision not to call a trial. He confirmed his awareness of the Fidelius charm switch and his strong suspicion, in the days immediately following, that Pettigrew rather than Sirius had been the actual secret keeper. He confirmed the speed with which he had acted to secure Harry's placement, the monitoring charm, the immediate dispatch of Hagrid, the prioritization of his own plan over the slower machinery of proper process. Why the speed? Marchbanks asked. Because I was afraid, Dumbledore said, and the gallery went very quiet, because Albus Dumbledore saying he was afraid was not something most people in that room had expected to hear in their lifetimes. I was afraid that if I moved through proper channels, the child would end up somewhere I could not control. The prophecy, which I have now disclosed in full to this panel, required Harry to have certain qualities when he faced Voldemort again. I believed I knew how to produce those qualities. He paused. I acted on that belief without consulting anyone. Without weighing the cost to the individuals most directly affected. He looked at his hands. Without adequately weighing the cost. Including the cost to the child, Marchbanks said. Yes. The child who had just lost both parents and whose legal guardian was imprisoned on your implicit authority. Yes. And who spent 10 years in an unsupervised placement that you arranged without any welfare assessment. Yes, Dumbledore said. Each yes was the same weight, the same tone. The accumulated yes were their own accounting. Marchbanks looked at him for a long moment. "Do you believe, Professor Dumbledore, that the ends you were working toward justified these means?" The chamber was still. Dumbledore was quiet for what felt like a full minute but was probably 20 seconds. "I believe," he said finally, "that I have spent my life telling myself they did. And I believe that the events of this week have shown me, with a clarity I could not have produced for myself, that I was wrong to tell myself that." He looked at the panel. "Not wrong about the threat. Not wrong about the importance of preparing to face it. Wrong about my right to make those preparations using other people's lives as instruments without their knowledge or consent." He paused. "Wrong about the idea that I could see clearly enough, or care enough, or be wise enough, to make those decisions on behalf of others and have that be sufficient justification." Another pause. "I am not sufficient justification. No single person is." The chamber received this. In the gallery, people were very still. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of something landing that is both unexpected and, now that it has landed, seems like it was always true. Amelia Bones let the silence sit for a moment before asking her next question. It was a small professional grace and it was the right call. The questioning of Dumbledore continued for another 40 minutes. By the end of it, the full architecture had been laid bare in formal record, every decision, every justification, every place where justification had been used to bypass conscience. It was not comfortable to watch. It was not meant to be. When he was released from the stand, Dumbledore walked back to his seat and sat down, and he did not look at the gallery. He looked at his hands in his lap, which was perhaps the most honest thing he'd done all week. Then Amelia Bones said, "Harry James Potter." Harry walked to the witness stand the way he walked everywhere, directly and without ceremony. He took the honesty oath in a voice that was clear and steady, and then he looked at the panel of 50 and the packed gallery and didn't perform anything about the fact that there were a great many people looking at him. Marchbanks looked at him from the center of the panel. "Harry," she said, and the use of his first name was deliberate, Sherlock noted, a choice to establish the register of this testimony as different from the formal evidentiary proceedings that had preceded it. "We've heard the documentary record. We've heard from the primary decision-makers. What I'd like you to tell this panel is what it was like to be the person those decisions were made about." Harry looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right." He talked for 35 minutes. He didn't rush it and he didn't overshape it. He talked about the cupboard under the stairs the way he'd mentioned it to John, with the same plain factual tone, not performing deprivation, not minimizing it either, just describing what had been true. He talked about 10 years of not knowing what he was, of being told his parents had died in a car accident, of being the odd one out in a family that was never his. He talked about arriving at Hogwarts at 11 feeling like he'd finally found somewhere he belonged, and then finding out that the person who'd kept him from knowing about that place for 11 years was the same person who was now his most trusted guide within it. "I want to be fair about Dumbledore," Harry said at one point, and the gallery rustled slightly. "He did teach me. He did care, in his way. The version of events he believed in, the one where all of this was necessary, that belief was genuine." He paused. "But genuine belief doesn't make the consequences less real. I still slept in the cupboard. Sirius still spent 13 years in Azkaban. My parents are still dead in circumstances that were never properly investigated." He looked at the panel. The truth of what happened to them, who betrayed them, how they were found, what actually occurred in that house, that should have been on formal record since November 1981. I should have grown up knowing it. Instead I grew up with a managed version that served someone else's plan. He paused. "That's not how you treat people." The chamber was very quiet. "I'm not asking for anyone to be punished out of proportion," Harry continued. "I'm asking for the record to be accurate. I'm asking for Sirius to have his name formally cleared, which is already done, and I'm grateful for that." He looked at Marchbanks directly. "I'm asking for the institutional failures that allowed all of this to happen to be looked at seriously, so that the next person who gets used as an instrument by someone with too much unaccountable authority has a better chance of someone asking the right questions sooner. He paused once more. And I'm asking, formally, on record, for this panel to acknowledge that James and Lily Potter were real people whose murders deserved a proper investigation. Not because it changes anything about their deaths, but because they deserved it. They were 21 years old and they were brave and they loved each other and they loved me, and no plan or prophecy or greater good makes them into symbols. They were people. I'd like the record to say so. He stopped. Silence. Then Griselda Marchbanks said, very quietly, the record will say so. The gallery above him was still for 3 seconds, and then it wasn't. The panel delivered its findings at 4 o'clock. Sherlock stood at the back of the chamber with John and listened as Marchbanks read the formal conclusions in her small, carrying voice. Sirius Black, formally and completely exonerated. Compensation proceedings to begin within 30 days. The MLE directed to conduct a full review of all imprisonments processed under Bartemius Crouch Sr. between 1979 and 1992, with particular attention to any cases where trial records were absent or incomplete. The deaths of James and Lily Potter, formally reclassified from unresolved homicide to murder under circumstances of institutional failure to investigate. A separate inquiry to be opened into the events of Halloween 1981 with authority to compel testimony and records from all surviving witnesses. A formal recommendation that the Somerset Constabulary cold case be reopened with full cooperation from the Ministry under the cross-jurisdictional agreement. The child welfare placement of Harry James Potter, found to have been conducted in violation of both Wizarding and Muggle child welfare law. A formal censure issued. The Dursley placement to be referred to the relevant Muggle Social Services Authority for retrospective review. Sherlock noted this last one with particular attention. Retrospective review was toothless in terms of what could be done for Harry now, but it was on record in both jurisdictions, and the Dursleys would find that the Muggle side of things had a long institutional memory. Albus Dumbledore, the finding on Dumbledore was the one the gallery leaned forward for. The panel found that his conduct in the immediate aftermath of October 31, 1981, constituted a serious abuse of the authority vested in the office of Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot and Headmaster of Hogwarts School. The deliberate decision not to call a trial for Sirius Black, made with knowledge that cast significant doubt on Black's guilt, was found to be a breach of statutory duty of the most serious kind. The child welfare arrangement was found to be both legally unsanctioned and in fundamental contradiction of Harry Potter's welfare. The panel did not remove Dumbledore from his position. Sherlock had known they wouldn't, and he told Harry as much on Wednesday evening when Harry had asked. The political and magical reality was that Dumbledore was still the most capable person to lead Hogwarts through whatever was coming with Voldemort, and Marchbanks was not a person who let personal censure override strategic necessity when the two were in direct conflict. But she was also not a person who let strategic necessity erase the record. The formal censure was the most extensive in the Wizengamot's history. It was specific, detailed, and permanent. It named every decision and its consequences. It would live in the formal record alongside Dumbledore's name for as long as records were kept. The findings also included a structural recommendation, the most important part, in Sherlock's assessment, calling for the establishment of an independent oversight body for the Ministry's law enforcement division with cross-jurisdictional participation from the British government under the 1692 treaty. Not a revolution. A structural repair, targeted and specific, the kind of reform that actually held because it was built into the machinery rather than dependent on the goodwill of whoever happened to be in charge. Hermione, sitting 3 rows behind Sherlock, made a sound when this finding was read that was somewhere between a gasp and a triumphant exhalation. Sherlock did not turn around but noted it with satisfaction. When Marchbanks finished reading, the chamber was briefly still and then became its own kind of noise, not chaos, but the collective sound of a large group of people processing significant information and beginning to have opinions about it, which was perhaps the most functional response a democracy could produce. Harry sat in the witness preparation area and looked at the high ceiling of the chamber, which was stone and ancient and had absorbed a great many significant moments over the centuries and would absorb this one and continue. John sat beside him. "Done," John said. "Done," Harry said. "How do you feel?" Harry thought about it properly, the way he'd been doing all week with questions that deserved proper answers. "Like something's been put in the right place," he said. "Like a bone set properly. It still hurts, but it's in the right position now." He looked at John. "Is that strange?" "No," John said. "That's exactly what it should feel like." The corridors of the ministry after the hearing had the particular energy of an institution adjusting to new facts about itself, which is always uncomfortable and frequently productive. Sherlock moved through it efficiently, making the 2 calls he'd been holding until the findings were delivered, one to Mycroft, which was brief and consisted primarily of Mycroft saying the Home Office was satisfied with the findings and the cross-jurisdictional agreement had been formally renewed with the new oversight provisions, and Sherlock saying good, and Mycroft saying you owe me 6 favors, and Sherlock ending the call. The second call was to Catherine Marsh, whose story would run tomorrow morning and who had spent the day in the press gallery taking notes with the focused intensity of someone who knew they were watching something worth watching. She answered immediately. "Front page," Sherlock said. "Above the fold," she said. "And the follow-up piece on the Dursley placement will run Sunday. The child welfare angle is getting picked up by 3 other papers." A pause. "Holmes. This is significant work." "It's accurate work," Sherlock said. "The significance belongs to the evidence." "That's a very modest thing for you to say." "I have my moments," he said, and ended the call. In the atrium, the group assembled with the organic ease of people who had spent 8 days moving toward a common point and had arrived. Sirius was talking to Tonks with the looser, slightly astonished quality that had been building in him all afternoon, the quality of someone finding that freedom, confirmed and formalized and recorded, felt different from the provisional freedom of the past 2 years of hiding. More real. More heavy, in the good way. Lupin stood nearby looking at Sirius with the expression of a man who had been quietly hoping for something for 13 years and was now standing in the reality of its having happened, and finding that reality both better and stranger than the hope. McGonagall was in the corner of the atrium speaking quietly with Amelia Bones, 2 women who had been doing their jobs inside a broken system for decades and were now, it appeared, discussing what the fixed version of that system might look like. Sherlock watched them for a moment and thought that the conversation they were having was probably more consequential than anything that had been said on the chamber floor today. Ron and Hermione were standing together slightly apart from everyone else. Ron was saying something and Hermione was listening with the particular quality of attention she reserved for things that mattered and people who were worth listening to. The document she'd been carrying all week, the thick, annotated, flagged file she'd built from the legal research, was under her arm, and she was not looking at it, which was its own kind of statement. Harry was standing in the middle of the atrium looking up. The atrium's ceiling was high and grand, the golden fountain at its center catching the afternoon light, the sound of the water continuous and indifferent. Harry was looking at it the way he'd looked at the water stain on the dormitory ceiling that morning, noticing it, perhaps for the first time, as a specific thing rather than background. Sherlock went and stood beside him. "There's something I want to ask you," Harry said, still looking up. "All right." "The anonymous letter." He turned to look at Sherlock directly. "Was it McGonagall?" Sherlock looked at him. "You worked it out," Harry said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Sherlock said. Harry nodded slowly. "I thought so. When she let us in on the first night, the way she let us in. She was already decided. She already knew she wanted this to happen." He looked back at the fountain. "Why didn't she tell you when you asked?" "Because telling me would have made it about her, and she didn't want it to be about her," Sherlock said. "She wanted it to be about you. About your parents." He paused. "It's consistent with everything else she is." Harry was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to talk to her tonight," Harry said. "When we get back." "I know." They stood with the fountain for another minute. Then Harry said, without looking away from the water, "What happens to you now?" You close the case. You go back to Baker Street. Yes. And the next cold case file through the letterbox. Presumably. Harry nodded. I'm glad it was this one, he said. Sherlock considered that. He considered the Tuesday morning when the package had arrived, the specific sound of it on the floor, the quality of the silence in the flat before he'd opened it. He considered the 8 days since, the castle and the lake and the sitting room fire, the documents and the hearing and the moments in between that the documents didn't capture. So am I, he said, which was not something he said often or lightly. Harry turned and looked at him. If I needed to, in the future, if something came up that was, you have the number, Sherlock said. Harry nodded. Okay. He paused. For what it's worth, you're pretty extraordinary at what you do. I know, Sherlock said. But thank you. Harry looked at him for a moment, and then something that had been almost a smile all week finally became a complete one, brief, real, and entirely unperformed. Come on, he said, and turned toward the group. Let's go home. They arrived back at Hogwarts as the sky went dark. The carriages came up the hill and the castle received them the way it always did, the lights in the windows, the warmth coming out through the great doors, the sense of a building that had been standing in this spot through centuries of difficult things and had opinions about continuity. In the entrance hall, Harry told the others to go ahead, that he'd catch up, and he went to find McGonagall. She was in her office, still in her formal robes, with a cup of tea that was actually hot for once, reading something on her desk that she set aside when Harry knocked and came in. He sat in the chair across from her desk, which he'd sat in a number of times for varying reasons, and looked at her for a moment. It was you, he said. McGonagall looked at him across the desk. For a moment her expression maintained its customary composure, and then it didn't. Not a dramatic shift, just a small loosening, the specific loosening of a person who has been holding something for a long time and has been given permission to set it down. Yes, she said. Why now? She was quiet for a moment. Because of last year, she said carefully. Because of what was asked of you last year, what you went through, and because Albus, because I watched him make the same calculations again, the same prioritization of the plan over the person. And I thought, she paused. I thought of your mother. She met his eyes. I thought of the girl I taught for 7 years who was brilliant and brave and specific and real, and of the woman she became, and of what she would think if she knew how her son had grown up. She straightened slightly. She would not have accepted it quietly. Harry looked at her. No, he said. She wouldn't. No. McGonagall looked at her teacup. I owed her better than quiet. The fire in her office made its small sounds. The portraits on the walls were tactfully still. Thank you, Harry said. McGonagall looked at him with the expression she used when sentiment threatened to become visible and she was managing it. Don't thank me. I should have done it sooner. You did it when you could, Harry said. When it would actually work. He paused. She'd understand that. Something moved across McGonagall's face that was private and brief and not for anyone else's observation. She looked at Harry, and in the looking was 40 years of a school, hundreds of students, and underneath it all a specific 17-year-old with red hair who had been extraordinary and had died too young and whose son was sitting across the desk looking at her with his mother's eyes and his father's face and his own particular unmanageable self. You're going to be all right, Potter, McGonagall said, in the tone she used for things she was certain about. Yeah, Harry said. I think so too. He stood, and at the door he paused and looked back at her. Next year, he said. If things get difficult, if Umbridge comes back, if the ministry causes problems, I will be here, she said, simply. I know, he said, and left. In the sitting room, Sherlock was packing the documents back into the folder for the last time. John was watching him with the expression he used when he wanted to say something and was deciding whether to. Go on, Sherlock said. It's a good case, John said. It's an important case, Sherlock said. Which is different? Both, John said. Sherlock looked at the folder in his hands. The folder that had arrived on a Tuesday morning with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. He thought about the concentric rings that weight had produced, outward and outward, through Hogwarts and the Ministry and the British government, and two worlds that had existed in careful, comfortable separation for over 300 years. The rings were still moving. They would continue to move. The formal inquiry into the events of Halloween 1981. The MLE review of Crouch Sr.'s cases. The structural reforms, the oversight body, the renewed treaty provisions. Catherine Marsh's story in the morning. The retrospective review of the Desley placement, which would arrive at Privet Drive in the form of a letter from Surrey Social Services and which Sherlock had ensured would be thorough. None of it would bring James and Lily Potter back. None of it would restore 13 years to Sirius or 10 years to Harry or the 30 years that had passed since two 21-year-olds had been left without the investigation they deserved. But it was on record now. Accurate and permanent and impossible to bury. Ready? John said. Nearly. Sherlock looked around the sitting room one last time, the fire, the portraits, the stone walls of a school that shouldn't exist and had existed for 1,000 years. He picked up his coat and the folder and the scarf from the back of the chair. Yes. Ready. They went downstairs and found Harry in the entrance hall with Sirius and Lupin and Ron and Hermione, all of them with the easy, tired quality of people at the end of something that has cost them something real. Sirius shook Sherlock's hand. His grip was firm and his eyes were direct, and he said, "Whatever you need, any time." "I mean that." "I'll remember it," Sherlock said. Lupin shook hands next, with a warmth that was quiet rather than demonstrative, and said simply, "Thank you," which covered more than a week. Hermione had a book to give him. She'd evidently been to the library that afternoon. Impossible Woman, a small volume on wizarding legal history that she pressed into his hands with the expression of someone who considered books the most appropriate expression of appreciation. "For reference," she said. "In case there are other cases." "There will always be other cases," Sherlock said, and tucked it into his coat pocket. Ron said, "You're brilliant but you're completely mad," which Sherlock took as the compliment it was clearly intended to be. Then Harry, who had been standing slightly back during all of this, stepped forward. He looked at Sherlock for a moment without speaking, which was fine. They had both spent the week demonstrating that silence didn't need filling. "I looked you up," Harry said. "When I knew you were coming. I found a few things written about you. Inaccurate, most of them," Sherlock said. "One of them said you don't take cases for money or recognition. That you take them when they interest you." He paused. "What interested you about this one?" Sherlock looked at him. The question deserved an honest answer, and he found, to his mild surprise, that he had one ready. "The gaps," he said. "Specifically the shape of the gaps. Most cover-ups are built out of lies. This one was built out of careful omissions, things that were allowed to not exist. The Aura investigation that wasn't opened. The trial that wasn't called. The welfare assessments that weren't done. The question that wasn't asked." He held Harry's gaze. "When a cover-up is built from absences rather than fabrications, it means the person who built it was either very intelligent or very frightened or both. I wanted to understand which." He paused. "It turned out to be both, which is always the most interesting answer." Harry looked at him. "And now you understand it?" "Completely," Sherlock said. Harry nodded. Then he said, very simply, "Good." He offered his hand and Sherlock shook it, and in the handshake was the entire week, the sitting room and the documents and the cold case file that had arrived on a Tuesday and the castle and the hearing and the boy who had been left on a doorstep and had grown up and stood in front of 50 Wisengamot members and asked for the record to be accurate. Good enough, Sherlock thought. That was the phrase. That was what justice looked like when you got close enough to see it clearly. Not restoration. Not resolution. Not the feeling of winning or losing or arriving somewhere final. Just good enough, things set right enough that the people they'd happen to could move forward from them on their own terms rather than someone else's. He and John walked out of the castle and down toward the lake, the night cold and clear around them, the castle lights behind them amber in the dark. "Lestrade's going to ask where we've been," John said. "Lestrade can wait," Sherlock said. "He's been calling. He's always calling." "Sherlock. I'll call him tomorrow." The lake was flat and silver dark, the water still and cold, the far shore invisible. Above them the sky was full of the kind of stars that only appeared when you were far enough from a city, and the castle behind them sat on its cliff in the way it had been sitting for 1,000 years and would continue to sit, old and specific and real, full of people whose lives were complicated and consequential and not reducible to symbols. John looked up at the stars. "Magic's real," he said, in the tone of a man who had been storing this observation for a week and had finally found the right moment for it. "Yes," Sherlock said. John considered. "That's really something." "It is," Sherlock agreed. They stood with the lake for a moment, the water and the stars and the cold, and then they turned and walked toward the village and the long road back to London, and behind them in the castle the lights burned warm and steady in all the high windows. And in the Gryffindor common room a boy sat with his friends by the fire reading a letter from his godfather that had arrived at dinner and was 4 pages long and full of things about his parents that nobody had told him before, and he read it with the specific quality of attention of someone receiving something they'd been owed for a very long time and were finally, at last, allowed to have.